Chapter 995, Conjoined Person. Emlyn glanced at Lon, raised his hand to pinch his nose, and chuckled. It appears you don't understand me. It's okay. A more simple description is to gather information about foreigners that come from the southern continent, especially from the Star Highlands and the Paws River Valley. What information do you want exactly? There are plenty of pure-blooded people from the southern continent in Backland. Those that you've mentioned are also common, Ian calmly asked without flaring up due to the contempt he received. Emlyn laughed. The ones that are a bit more abnormal. They do things in a fishy manner and seem to all be mysterious. You should understand what I'm getting at. There are definitely many people you describe. In Backland, they are either servants, workers, or thieves being part of gangs. As the latter will all meet your criteria of being abnormal, fishy, and mysterious. Ian sincerely pointed out how unpragmatic Emlyn's request was. Emlyn was already prepared for this. With an unobvious smile, he nodded slightly. Then, give me all the information that meets those criteria. I'll do the filtering. Oh, I'll pay £50 as down payment for this commission as the standard fees for the early stage investigations. The subsequent payment will be counted based on how much information of value is provided. Each one will cost £20. Who is the one to determine its worth? Ian asked after a few seconds of thought. For him, having a £50 income for preliminary work like this was enough for him to accept the job. It was more than enough to hire a dozen people or so to investigate the areas from East Borough to Sherwood Borough for half a month. He didn't mind how much he could only from the £50, as there were many people here who relied on him for their survival. He needed to arrange jobs with payment for them to do from time to time, otherwise, he would never be able to be kept abreast with the latest developments. Emlyn sized up Ian and scoffed. Of course it will be me. You should know how trustworthy I am. Detective Moriarty never told me that, Ian mumbled and sighed. All right. Our last cooperation was still pretty good. I choose to trust you. Emlyn nodded in satisfaction, took out his wallet, and counted another £50 worth of notes. During this process, Emlyn momentarily felt the pinch when he realized he only had £407 in savings. And now there's only £357. He looked away from the notes and handed the cash to Ian. He didn't stay. Putting on his hat, he walked out of the billiard room and left the Bravehearts bar. On the street, Emlyn stopped pinching his nose and looked up at the flame-like clouds. His expression gradually fell heavy as he silently muttered, that wraith from before isn't around. Where did it go? Humph, Ian acted as though he had never heard of the Rose School of Thought, but his racing heartbeat had betrayed him. Also, he actually didn't ask if Sherlock Moriarty is back in Backland. He didn't even show any concern. Could it be that Sherlock has already returned to Backland and that he has already met him? Rorstad Archipelago, City of Generosity, Biyao. In an area near the harbor, Admiral of Stars Catlia had brought along Frank Lee, who had his sleeves rolled up which revealed his brown hair, to an area outside a house with gas wall lamps. They came to an empty corner and watched as a figure appeared out of the shadows. It was bloodless Heath Doyle who was in charge of monitoring Artisan Sealth. He was thin and his skin was so pale that it was transparent. He looked so frail that a gust of wind could topple him. Did anything strange happen recently? Catlia nudged the gold-rimmed glasses on her nose. Heath Doyle tersely acknowledged. 3 days after you left, a stranger visited Sealth. He stayed for about 15 minutes. I didn't approach for fear of being discovered. Based on your instructions, I sent men to tail the stranger, but they lost his trail. What did that stranger look like? Catlia asked with a slight nod. Heath Doyle took out a piece of raw beef from a leather pouch by his waist. The blood on it remained fresh, but it didn't show any signs of contamination. It appeared to be a pure piece of solid meat. Right on the heels of that, this piece of beef melted in Heath Doyle's hand, dripping to the ground like water. They then squirmed like they had life, drawing a portrait. This is the effect I want. Frank Lee's eyes shimmered as he watched this scene, expressing his intentions with excitement. Under his gaze, Heath Doyle had the intention to run, but he slightly slanted his body and pointed to the ground. Roughly like this. At this moment, a blood portrait had already taken form. It was that of a man with a mustache, with facial features that resembled that of the Paws River Valley. His greatest characteristic was the 3-ear studs on both his ears. Golden ear studs, thin body, not much fat, very athletic, Heath Doyle added. Katlia retracted her gaze from the ground and asked, "And then?" Heath Doyle tersely acknowledged. No one visited Sealf after that, other than his temporary servants and chef he hired. I got men to investigate them. They are clean. Sealf has an evening stroll at a fixed time every day. He will bring a prostitute home, allowing her to leave only at daybreak. I've been constantly tailing him, but I never discovered any contact with odd people. He has been acting very normally all this time. Katlia asked with a frown. From her point of view, not having any abnormalities made it most abnormal. After all, this involved Rose's school of thought members that believed in the primordial moon. Heath Doyle nodded in affirmation. Yes. Katlia turned her head to look at the building's main door and said after some thought, I actually planned on using Beyonder powers to infiltrate and bring Sealf under control in the fastest speed possible before taking him away to prevent any accidents. But from the looks of it, the best solution is to knock on the door. Unknown danger was what terrified people the most. At the thought that he had been busy with his experiments recently and hadn't done his duty as first mate, Frank Lee hurriedly said, Captain, I'll go with you. Katlia took off her thick glasses and hung them by her waist of her black warlock robe before nodding. Okay. With that said, she left the shadowy corner and walked towards the main door of Sealf's residence. As she approached, she looked up at the crimson moon that could be seen penetrating through the clouds. She curled her fingers and tapped thrice on the door. Before long, footsteps approached and the door creaked open. Sealf didn't show any obvious changes from the previous time. He remained thin and dark. His eyes were somewhat puffy, and his brown eyes were trying hard to force a smile. Admiral, is there something this time? He stood by the door, blocking the gas wall lamp's light behind him. It made the area appear dark and gloomy, as though he was sinking into the shadows. Katlia stared at him for a few seconds before saying slowly, I have a new idea. I plan on making you a part of my crew. She stood there motionlessly without any intention of stepping inside. Sealf's expression warped as his voice turned somewhat dark. Why? Katlia's eyes seemed to freeze as she slowly said, because I'm a pirate. Pirates didn't need reasons. They did whatever they did out of their own desires. Sealf's facial muscles twitched as a smile suffused his eyes once again. I can be your sailor, but as an artisan, I'll be of much greater use in a city. I agree, Katlia destroyed his resistance. But before then, I need you to spend some time on the future to be partners with others. Sealf's expression gradually turned cold as he replied in an ethereal voice, I'm afraid I won't be able to control myself. I have a strong urge to procreate every day. Strong urge to procreate? Frank Lee's eyes lit up as he asked, seemingly in confirmation. Sealf was taken aback as he wasn't sure whether to nod or shake his head. Frank then looked at Katlia and asked in excitement, Captain, is he going to be my assistant for my experiments? I love this trait of his. Katlia fell silent for a few seconds before nodding heavily. Yes. Frank immediately revealed a bright smile and offered his right hand to artisan Sealf. Pleasure to meet you. Let me introduce myself. First mate of the future, Frank Lee. Sealf's expression returned to normal as he shook the man's hand with puzzlement. Then, he said, am I really going to spend a short period of time on the future? I guarantee it with my reputation on the line, Katlia sincerely replied before inwardly adding, it wouldn't take long before Her Majesty personally handles you. All right. It's not like I can beat you. Sealf shrugged. Please permit me to pack my personal belongings. He then took 2 steps back, turned around, and walked to the staircase at the end of the foyer. As he walked, he suddenly paused and said in an ethereal tone to Katlia and Frank Lee, "Today's moonlight is as beautiful as it always has been, isn't it?" Without receiving a reply, he proceeded forward and vanished from the staircase. At this moment, Katlia's heavy expression became obvious. After Sealf opened the door, she had already noticed an abnormality with her eyes. In the past, Sealf's spirit body was that of an ordinary human, but now, he was a conjoined person. Under the illumination of the moonlight, this conjoined person was being nourished and was rapidly growing stronger. "This isn't a problem I can resolve. I have to write to Her Majesty. Also, I mustn't forget Gairman Sparrow's request for a meeting." Katlia sighed silently as she subconsciously looked up. High in the sky, a crimson moon remained bright and silent amidst the thin clouds. Backlund, Hillston Backlund, East Balham Military Veterans Mess. Dwayne Dantes and Mocht got off their separate carriages and entered the lobby together. Chapter 996 Card Game. After entering the East Balham Military Veterans Mess, Klein handed his cane and hat to his valet, Enuni, only to see Colonel Calvin of the Lone Kingdom's Ministry of Defense wearing an army uniform, waiting at the foyer with a glass of red wine in hand. This long-faced officer smiled as he raised his cup at Dwayne Dantes. "Long time no see." "It really has been a while." Klein smiled as he walked over. Colonel Calvin immediately offered his right hand. "Congratulations. You did pretty well." Everyone was very pleased. "I was very pleased as well." Klein used a Lone-styled euphemism to express his pleasure in cooperating. He then shook hands with him. Calvin retracted his arm and glanced at Mocht before he said with a laughing sigh, "Back when you first introduced Dwayne, I was quite distrustful of your judgment, but now I understand how you're a member of Parliament." Anyone who interacts with Dwayne can easily tell that he's an expert at this. Mocht accepted the colonel's approbation with the same Lone-styled euphemism. Calvin retracted his gaze, sipped some red wine, and smiled at Dwayne Dantes, asking in passing, "How much did you earn this time?" "Don't worry, I won't raise prices in the future because of it. I'm simply curious." £20,000 in gold, Klein gave the midpoint value as an answer. In actual fact, he had earned £25,000, but after paying Miss Messenger £10,000 for her services, he had only earned £15,000. Calvin nodded. "Not bad. If you need to convert those gold bars into gold coins, I can introduce you to someone from an Imperial Mint factory." "How was it? Did you notice anything abnormal around Maysanchez area?" Klein said directly without thinking, "Yes. There was a place called Revival Square under his control that was destroyed by lightning." "That, I'm aware of," Calvin replied with a rather heavy expression. "But you probably do not know that the person before you was the one who created the lightning." Klein smiled and then said, "Also, Maysanchez seems to be maintaining a fragile balance among many factions, but in actual fact, he has already secretly aligned himself with a particular faction. Of course, I'm not exactly sure who it is. He had no intention of betraying the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. All he did was divulge a little to win the trust of the lone military. The only thing that can be confirmed is that it isn't us." Calvin nodded and said with a deep look in his eyes, "It's unlikely to be Intis." Klein helped him eliminate one of the wrong choices. Calvin tersely acknowledged. "That isn't a bad thing either. The few factions surrounding Maysanchez are supported by Intis. If he wishes to expand, there's no way he can circumvent them. When the time comes, perhaps we will have more arms sales on our hands." With that said, he offered a toast. "Holy Lord of Storms, to riches for everyone." As believers of the Evernight Goddess, Klein and Mocht smiled in response without giving a direct answer. After taking another sip of red wine, Calvin pointed at the second floor. "Dwayne, I brought you here today to play cards with a VIP. Texas Hold'em." "Which VIP?" Klein asked with piqued interest. Calvin's expression turned solemn as he said with an unobvious smile, "Admiral Amirius. He has been given a post and is currently in charge of the Ministry of Defense." Admiral Amirius. The admiral, whose younger brother was stripped of his post as governor-general, had his mistress corrupted by the mother tree of desire, and ended up losing his post as highest commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy? I've worked with him before and even pretended to be him for some time. Indeed, when it comes to a demigod, as long as they didn't screw up too badly, and if they are willing to hold it in, they will always be able to step out of the nadir. Klein recalled everything that had happened at Orovie Island, turning wistful. Towards Admiral Amirius Revolt, he still felt some guilt towards him. Although most of what happened back then didn't have anything to do with him, his mistress's anomaly was ultimately a result of the Mother Tree of Desire's wish to control him. That is to say that our future cooperation requires His Excellency's approval? Klein asked in enlightenment. That's how it is. Calvin nodded and pointed up the stairs. Let's head on up. When they arrived at the second floor, they stopped in front of a pair of dark red double doors. Calvin turned his head to glance at Dwayne Dantes. Your mission today is to lose money. Lose money? Klein sized up Calvin as he curled the ends of his mouth. I'll try my best. By the side, Mocked said with a laugh, there's actually no need to be too deliberate. Admiral Amirius has excellent card-playing skills. It's almost impossible if you wish to win any money. Heh, I always lose. Sigh, I just hope I won't lose too much today. Otherwise, I wouldn't even dare to return home. Klein nodded thoughtfully. I only brought £200 in cash. Would that be enough? Definitely not. Calvin chuckled. I've already changed chips worth £1,000 for you. Just remember to return it. Loan's best lawyers only earn about £1,000 a year on the surface. You bunch of profligates. Klein sized up Calvin again. This colonel didn't notice it as he knocked on the door. After a while, the double door creaked open, revealing the scene inside. It was a hall paved with thick, soft carpets. There wasn't a lot of furniture, making it appear rather spacious. In the middle of the hall was a card table that could accommodate more than 10 people. Surrounding it were luxurious-styled high-back chairs. By the sides of the hall were gold-plated cutlery, marble-carved sculptures, coffee tables with books and newspapers, and a series of leather sofas. Klein looked over and saw Amirius Revolt sitting at the seat of honor. This admiral didn't look different from before. His black hair was neatly combed backward, with his blue eyes dark and profound. The corners of his lips drooped slightly, and his face was clean-shaven. He had an austere temperament, and he wore dark blue clothes with an epaulette. He was meticulous in every detail, appearing extremely serious. When he swept his gaze, Klein found another, familiar person. He had thick but neat black brows with a short and hard crew cut of the same color. He had dark blue eyes and a high nose bridge with a bushy mustache spreading out from his mouth. He had a long face with accentuated outlines as well as callous curves. He was MI9's deputy director, Konas Kilgore. He was one of the targets for Klein's return to Backlund. He was the middleman in the dealings between the Demonist sect and a particular faction in the royal family. He was one of the accomplices of the Great Smog of Backlund. This brigadier general had abnormally broad shoulders, making his white shirt and black vest abnormally tight. He was playing Texas Hold'em with great focus. There are 3 demigods at a card table. How can this even be played? Interesting. Klein sat down and began observing the others at the table. During this process, an attendant delivered a huge stack of chips, worth a total of £1,000. In the first few rounds, Klein folded after looking at his cards. He acted very cautiously, acting as though he never called or raised unless he had good cards. As for Admiral Amirius, his style was the complete opposite of him. He was in no way conservative. He called almost every round, constantly raising in an extremely aggressive manner. Every round that he was involved in seldom reached the point where everyone showed their cards. Most people failed to withstand such aggression and, with the admiral's domineering force, they would call a round or two before folding. At times, someone would attempt to call Amirius Revolt's bluff, only to encounter 4 nines. The color in his face instantly drained as though he had been passed the death verdict by a judge. Kona's Kilgore had a completely different style as well. He would occasionally lose a round, but the chips lost wouldn't be much, preventing him from having too great a loss. And in the next round after his loss, he would often be able to wipe out the person who won all his chips the previous round, forcing him to spend money to buy in again. Is there a need? Why are you using powers to cheat when dealing with low and mid-sequence Beyonders or even ordinary people? Others might not be able to tell, but would I be fooled? One has the Arbiter Pathway's dominance, and the other has the Baron of Corruption's bribe. Klein looked at his 5 of hearts and 9 of clubs as he shook his head indiscernibly. He couldn't help but consider which powers of a seer pathway could provide him help if he wanted to cheat. Turn all my opponents into marionettes? In that case, I can win as much as I want. I'm practically invincible, but it's of no pragmatic value. It's not like I'm planning for some deathmatch poker tournament. Unfortunately, there aren't any mosquitoes here. Otherwise, I can use their spirit body threads and turn them into marionettes to help me check out their whole cards. Faceless only allows me to change myself, not the cards. Magician's illusion? The effects would likely be pretty good when playing with ordinary people or low and mid-sequence Beyonders. But there are 2 demigods here. Use a clown's ability to swap cards? It's useless. The dealing and shuffling of cards are done by the croupier. As his thoughts raced, Klein realized that apparently only his powers as a seer was of use here. He threw out his 2 whole cards to indicate a fold before taking out a metal chip and allowing it to move between his fingers. At this moment, Amirius Revolt suddenly looked up at him and retracted his hands before pushing all his chips in. Indeed. Klein nodded inwardly without a hint of surprise. During his last cooperation, he knew that Admiral Amirius was able to distinguish ordinary people from Beyonders from his position. He suspected that he could even determine a Beyonders level, or in other words their position. However, Klein wasn't too worried, because a Bizarro sorcerer had concealment powers to a certain degree. This was also why he could converge the augmentation effect the gray fog had on him after he reached sequence 4. This made him confident that Amirius wouldn't be able to determine his level. However, he didn't attempt any corresponding interference, as he suspected that Amirius was able to tell that he was a Beyonder. Therefore, he decided to reveal a tiny problem, making it easy to be seen through and be grasped. Chapter 997, Gambling God, Dwayne. The core rules of Texas Hold'em were very simple. It was to use 2 whole cards and 5 community cards to form a hand with any 5-card combination. Whoever had the biggest hand won. And the community cards were dealt in 3 phases. 3 community cards to form the flop in the first phase, a 4th community card called the turn in the second phase, and a 5th community card called the river in the third phase. Each phase allowed players to fold, check, call, or raise. This continued until everyone was done or until one person didn't fold. Klein fiddled with the chip in his hand as he divined the existence of any lucky instances within the next few rounds. However, he was unable to tell which exact round it was. After all, it was only a quick and simple divination with average effects. Using this method to play with ordinary people and low-sequence Beyonders wouldn't be a problem as long as the correct strategy is used, but it's definitely inadequate against demigods. It's already quite a challenge to defeat a mid-sequence Beyonder. Must I close my eyes each round and do a complete dream divination? Heh, if that were the case, Dwayne Dantes might end up with the title, Sleeping Gambling God. Klein sighed inwardly. He continued watching the round play out as he sat by the side. At present, he had already lost a big blind and a small blind sup 2e/sup when it was his turn. At this moment, Klein noticed one point. The MI9 deputy director, Kona's Kilgore, had lost 20 pounds to Admiral Amirius. A successful bribe. Admiral Amirius should be able to tell that Kona's is using his powers as a Baron of Corruption, but he might not know that this MI9 deputy director is a demigod. The next round will be interesting. Hee. Klein jolted to attention as the new round began. He didn't check his whole cards when the croupier handed him 2 new ones. Instead, he placed the metal chip he was playing with in his hand onto his whole card, taking on the stance of not planning to look at them. After 2 people folded, the stern and old-fashioned Emerius Revolt casually took a look at his whole cards. After counting £5 worth of chips, he threw it into the middle of the table, having raised the stakes without garnering any surprises. Another person folded as mocked called. Right on the heels of that, Konas Kilgore, who had an unyielding personality, raised the stakes, throwing out a total of £20. Calvin confirmed his whole cards once again before calling. After one last person folded, Dwayne Dantes didn't do an actual count. He grabbed a handful of chips and threw it out. The croupier who was in charge of counting the chips glanced at it before precisely announcing Dwayne's action, £20. Call. I thought it would be £50. From the looks of it, I'm still not very used to these chips, the white-sideburn Dwayne Dantes with an outstanding temperament said with a laugh. However, he didn't add on the additional £30. At this moment, no one made a move. It was Emerius Revolt's turn again. This admiral didn't even glance at the remaining players. Picking up 5 10-pound chips, he threw them out. Another raise. He didn't show any perturbations in his emotions, acting as though he was ordering a cup of black tea. However, that indescribable sense of dominance and the act of repeatedly raising the stakes pre-flop made the mood at the table freeze. Such situations often implied that Admiral Emerius had excellent hole cards. Perhaps they were a pair of aces or a pair of kings, or an ace and king. Mock decided to fold. Konas Kilgore rubbed his high-nosed bridge and glanced around with his dark blue eyes before saying, "Call." Colonel Calvin confirmed his cards again. After 10 seconds of hesitation, he chose to fold. Dwayne Dantes touched the metal chip on his 2 whole cards and smiled. Call. After a round of expressing their intentions, there were only 3 players for the round. Then, the croupier flipped the 3 community cards in the middle of the table for the flop. 2 spade suit, 9 heart suit, K spade suit. The person who was up first was Admiral Emerius Revolt. He leaned forward slightly and said in a domineering manner, £50. He had immediately raised the stakes to £50. Mocked, Calvin, and company, including those who weren't in the game, felt stifled for some baffling reason. Konas Kilgore trembled slightly, but he ultimately grabbed £50 and threw it out. Dwayne Dantes glanced at the deputy director of MI9. Completely unfazed by the pressure, he said with a smile, "Call." Upon hearing this, Calvin turned his head and nodded at Dwayne Dantes with his deep blue eyes that resembled a nighttime lake, indicating his approval. From his point of view, Admiral Emerius's domineering stance didn't affect a person who came to lose money. At this moment, the red-vested croupier revealed the 4th card, the turn, 9 spade suit. There were 3 spades, increasing the chances of a flush tremendously. However, Admiral Emerius still didn't hesitate. He calmly pushed a stack of chips, £100. Konas Kilgore's fingers tapped on his whole cards, showing his lack of confidence. But ultimately, he chose to call. Dwayne Dantes glanced at this deputy director once again and maintained his warm smile. Call. At this point in time, he had yet to see his whole cards, making Calvin somewhat worried. He believed that such an act was going overboard, a clear act of throwing money away. It wasn't something Admiral Emerius, who was relatively conservative, might find acceptable. At this moment, the red-vested croupier revealed the final card, the river, 2 club suit. As such, the community cards took form, 2 spade suit, 9 heart suit, K spade suit, 9 spade suit, 2 club suit. £200. Admiral Emerius pushed a pile of metal chips in with an extremely domineering attitude. Konas Kilgore took a deep breath before pushing 2 stacks of chips. £500. This amount of money was half of his purported annual salary. Is he trying to bluff? Calvin and Mock exchanged looks, believing that Brigadier General Kilgore had made it too obvious, making it easy to see through him. One had to know that when playing Texas Hold'em, apart from doing risk management and probability calculations, it also involved psychological battles most of the time. Be it in terms of body language, expression, or the style used for raises, they made it easy to expose one's hidden cards. Of course, good players could also use these details to deliberately misdirect their opponents. Dwayne Dantes sized up Kona's Kilgore before he laughed. Then, like the previous few times, he said, "Call." Amirius raised his hands, prepared to push all his remaining chips, to pressure his opponents into folding. At this moment, he suddenly paused. His deadpan expression wore a look of solemnity. After a few seconds of silence, he calmly said, "Call." At this point, the whole cards could be revealed to compare each person's hand. Admiral Amirius flipped his card first. It was an ace-spade suit and 10-spade suit. It formed a flush with the 2-spade suit, K-spade suit, and 9-spade suit. It was a rather high-ranking hand, with the only ones bigger than it being a full house, 4 of a kind, straight flush, and royal flush. "It's your turn," Amirius then urged Kona's. Kona's first flipped open a single card, K-diamond suit. It made 2 pairs with the K and 9 from the community cards. Following that, he picked up his second whole card. At that moment, the remaining poker cards at the red-vested croupier's end blurred. Pa! The whole card was flipped open, revealing itself, 9-club suit. "What?" Mocked and company exclaimed, hardly believing their eyes. This meant that Kona's Kilgore had obtained a full house, 9s over kings. It was bigger than a flush. "Sorry about that." "Full house," Kona's looked at Amirius and said with a smile. Then, he turned to look at Dwayne Dantes. "You can reveal your cards. I'm also very curious as to what my cards are." Dwayne Dantes smiled. He picked up the metal chip that he had placed down on his cards and very casually flipped the 2 whole cards. What?" Calvin and company rubbed their eyes. Dwayne Dantes's whole cards were a very weak pair, 2 heart suit, 2 diamond suit. There happened to be a very small pair in the community cards, 2 spade suit, 2 club suit. They formed a 4 of a kind, the smallest rank when it came to 4 of a kind, but it was higher ranked than all the full houses. Praise the lady. Dwayne Dantes drew the crimson moon across his chest in pleasant surprise, looking as though he had never expected it. An interesting round. Amirius was taken aback for a moment before he gently clapped. Kona's Kilgore gave Dwayne Dantes a deep look and said with a laughing sigh, "I never expected the final winner to be you." Klein wiped the smile from his face as he inwardly grumbled, "It's only right that I win over the 2 of you." On the one hand, Admiral Amirius enjoys pressuring others and doesn't really rely on his beyonder powers to cheat. As for you, you placed your focus and beyonder powers on Admiral Amirius, thus, ignoring me. On the other hand, the one playing cards with you is actually named Winner Anuni. Without even looking at his whole cards, it was obvious that he was relying solely on luck. At the moment he placed his chip on the whole cards, Klein had already swapped positions with Anuni as they switched faces with each other. Although Colonel Calvin had gotten him to deliberately lose £1,000, Klein decided to win a killing after he saw Kona's Kilgore. This wasn't because he couldn't bear to part with the money. Instead, his main motive was to garner the attention of this Mi-9 demigod. He wanted to get familiar with him and build relationships. Only by doing this could Klein have an opportunity to obtain intelligence from Kona's Kilgore and even carry out an assault on him. After all, he was a demigod. To deal with him in Backland required sufficient care and caution. He would rather give up an operation if he lacked the confidence to guarantee a kill or lure him away from Backland. Otherwise, he was bound to expose himself, ending up being surrounded by demigods and even angels in Backland. In the subsequent rounds, Klein won and lost different rounds. In the end, not only did he keep his £1,000 in chips, but he had even won nearly an additional £1,000. During this process, Calvin had gestured to Dwayne Dantes to lose, but he was left stupefied by the latter's ridiculous good luck that left him undefeatable. After the game came to an end, a person walked over to Dwayne Dantes with a smile. Konas Kilgore. 1 big blind is equal to the minimum bet. 2 the small blind is normally half the big blind. Chapter 998 Establishing relations with dark blue eyes. Konas Kilgore, who had crew-cut hair which was seldom seen among members of high society, held a cup of champagne as he walked up to Dwayne Dantes. He said with a smile, "You had great luck today. You also had plenty of courage." One if he's referring to me immediately folding after receiving a bribe, with me rather losing a big blind, that's not luck but knowledge. As for the other times, playing cards with all of you has pretty much drained all of Anuni's recently accumulated good luck. Klein swirled the cup with pale golden alcohol in his hand and said with a laughing sigh, "For a person who doesn't care about the outcome, there's naturally nothing to fear." "Heh heh," praised the lady. He was using a loan-style euphemism to indicate that he was mainly here to lose money and that his good luck was all thanks to the blessings of a deity. It had nothing to do with himself. Konas hadn't lost much tonight, approximately 100 to 200 pounds. Although this was already a considerable amount when compared to his purported salary, to a Brigadier General Deputy Director of MI9, a hidden demigod, his salary was the most trivial part of his income. Therefore, he didn't mind it. He shook his head with a smile. Humans often have no way of seeing through the arrangement of fate. "You are an interesting person. It's a pleasure to meet you." His final sentence was both a form of praise and also a part of the formalities. It indicated that their conversation was over. However, Klein had acted all night to acquaint himself with this demigod of the Black Emperor pathway, so how could he give up? He first replied, "It's my pleasure as well." Then, he asked in a seemingly random manner, "Your Excellency, are you familiar with the manors in the Backland suburbs? It's best if they come with forests for hunting." According to the information Klein had received from Miss Justice, Konas Kilgore didn't enjoy holding banquets, balls, or saloons at his place. Neither did he accept invitations on such matters. It was unknown if it was a problem with his character or due to his job. He had very simple hobbies. First, he enjoyed smoking cigars, especially chieftain cigars from East Balam's Mikan, recognized as the best cigars in the world. Second, he enjoyed playing cards, especially Texas Hold'em. Third, he enjoyed hunting. He often headed to the Backland suburbs during autumn and winter. He even headed to Awa County or East Chester County for hunting. Klein was already planning on buying a manor, an expenditure meant solely to integrate himself into high society. He hadn't made any decisions yet, but after meeting Konas Kilgore today, he suddenly added this request in a bid to garner his interest. When the time came, he could even invite this MI9 deputy director to hunt in the suburbs over an enjoyable weekend. He could then seek out an opportunity to take action. Konas Kilgore drank a mouthful of champagne and said after some thought, "I'll help you take note of it. If there's anything suitable, I'll send someone over." "Baklun Street, right?" "Yes, someone will inform you there." "Thank you very much," Klein earnestly replied. At the same time, he pitied his former valet, Richardson, who had now become an assistant butler. This young man who wished to better himself recently went out early in the morning and returned late at night. He had been gathering information about manors in Backland suburbs, filtering out those that met the requirements and the ones which were on sale. He had been personally visiting them in a bid to list down options which were all flawless. He didn't wish for his employer to spot something he fancied only to find out that it wasn't for sale, or that the actual conditions were far worse what was described. And after Klein suddenly changed his request, all the work that Richardson had done was undoubtedly made useless. The all-evil party, in contracts always changes their requirements and requests. "Yes, after this is done, I'll get Taneja to raise his annual salary by £5. As an assistant butler, he should naturally earn more than his time as a valet. £5. It was gone in just 1 or 2 raises in today's game. Richardson's annual salary is only enough to play a few rounds of Texas Hold'em. Klein sighed inwardly when he sensed eyes looking at him. He directly looked back and realized that it was Admiral Emerius Revolt. This old-fashioned and stern middle-aged man nodded gently and retracted his gaze. He had no intentions of communicating with Dwayne Dantes, nor did he get anyone to arrest this unaffiliated beyonder. After all, he was considered a working partner of the military, and it wasn't rare for a merchant, an adventurer with wide connections, to be able to obtain a potion. At this moment, Colonel Calvin and Member of Parliament Mocht walked over to Dwayne Dantes with wine glasses in hand. "What happened?" Calvin asked with an exasperated and suppressed voice. As Dwayne Dantes had won nearly £1,000, he and Mocht had to change their strategies to prevent Admiral Emerius from losing any money. They went from a tight strategy to an unrestrained one. They felt quite the pinch from losing several £100 each. As such, adding to everyone's losses, Admiral Emerius had won a total of nearly £300. With regards to this, Klein spread his hands. "I didn't even look at my whole cards." In between the lines, he meant that this was simply the blessings of some deity that controlled luck. At the moment, the deities, angels, and secret existences who had authority in the fate domain included, but were not limited to, the Evernight Goddess, the Fool, Snake of Mercury Will-Osepton, Palez Zoroast, Blasphemer Amon, and Snake of Fate Ouroboros. "This is really such a vexing matter," Mocht said with a bitter smile while shaking his head. "Calvin and I don't even dare to return home after what we've lost." They had roughly lost about half their purported annual income. Dwayne Dantes, with grayed sideburns, revealed a surprised look. "When did you guys lose?" He then pointed at the pile of chips at his seat. "I just happened to retain the £1,000 I bought in at the beginning. The rest are yours, isn't that so?" Calvin and Mocht were taken aback as they exchanged looks. Then, they revealed smiles. "We must have counted wrongly due to the anxiety." Calvin gave an approving nod. Klein laughed and immediately changed the topic. He then began looking at supper that was placed on the coffee table beside him. City of Silver, in the spire of one of the Twin Towers. Derek Berg once again met the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad. "You said that you have something you would like to ask me about?" Colin, who had quite a number of old scars on his face, calmly asked the youth who wasn't considered too tall. Derek bowed and replied frankly, "Yes, Your Excellency. In the advancement for Priest of Light, I need pure darkness, but once I do it, it will be extremely dangerous. I'm wondering if there are any solutions." Colin Iliad listened seriously before nodding. "You have to confirm one point. Is it pure darkness, or darkness with zero light? These two concepts are very different. If it's the latter, you can obtain that in the Spire's underground dungeons. You've been there for some time, so you should know what I'm talking about." Derek had a deep fear for the Spire's dungeons because it was there that he first met Blasphemer Amon. Not only did he see the former captain of the expedition team, but he had even been parasitized. Unless it was necessary, he really didn't wish to recall it. At this moment, after receiving the chief's reminder, he began to slowly jolt his memories. He discovered that, under the spire, although each cell was given candles, one would have to wait for the guards to deliver food and medicine and ask for more once they finished burning. This didn't happen frequently, with it happening only thrice a day with the gaps in between being very long. And in such an environment, phenomena like the appearance of monsters and the vanishing of humans never appeared. Derek recalled that he had been in darkness with zero light for some time without encountering any danger. He pondered for a moment and hesitantly said, "The darkness with zero light at the bottom of the spire has external powers involved?" It was this power that prevented the darkness from making people disappear or producing monsters. Colin Iliad looked at the two swords that were hung up in a cross-like fashion on the wall. He looked up and sighed. "Yes, that's why it's called darkness with zero light, not pure darkness." Derek frowned slightly as he tried to recall. After a few seconds, he said without certainty, "If that's the case, the darkness outside the spire's basement isn't pure darkness as well. In many historical records, the nights before the Dark Ages didn't make people vanish or produce monsters. Now, the darkness must have undergone an abnormal change or had some other forces mixed into it to turn it dangerous. Not bad. For you to make such connections shows that you've improved. Therefore, let me ask you again. Do you need pure darkness or darkness with zero light? Colin's light blue eyes revealed a hint of surprise. This. Could it be that pure darkness only exists outside the forsaken land of the gods? Derek turned gloomy before he pumped himself up. Your Excellency, I'm not too sure either. I'll take some time to confirm this. He believed that the experienced and strong Mr. Hanged Man, Mr. World, and the other members of the Tarot Club could give him a good solution. Colin Iliad didn't ask further as he said with a nod, go on then. Once you reach sequence 5, even if you aren't able to become a demigod for a long period of time, you will have the chance of wielding certain sealed artifacts. One Backlund, Hillstonborough, Zio changed into a brown jacket and wore a cap, pretending to be a very ordinary short man. She had officially taken the commission and had begun tailing and investing the gentleman named Ernst Boyar. There were also a few other bounty hunters who participated in this mission. Ernst Boyar lifted his top hat and pointed his cane forward as he instructed the carriage driver, to St. George Borough. It was southeast of Backlund, separated from East Borough by the Tussock River. Once he got on his carriage and took his seat, Ernst sniffed. He looked out the window and suddenly grunted. As a sanguine viscount, how could he not have discovered the clumsy bounty hunters tailing him? Chapter 999 Instigation. When Ernst left on a carriage, the few bounty hunters hiding in the vicinity immediately appeared. Without being stingy about the costs involved, they immediately stopped any rental carriages that passed by. Some memorized the target carriage's traits and attempted to take shortcuts through the cramped, isolated paths to catch up to it. Others rode on the bikes they had prepared ahead of time, swerving through the crowds and carriages with their bells ringing. It was very easy for them to keep pace. Among them, only Zio was completely composed. She remained in her spot, watching Ernst and her peers leave. This transportation tool known as a bicycle is more useful than I imagined. It's no wonder so many bounty hunters have saved up to buy one. This can save expenses from taking carriages and save time walking. If one often has such tracking missions, then the money saved is enough to buy a brand new bike. The only problem is that this mode of transportation tool has very few models available. All of them have high seats. Zio was enticed. At this moment, a tracked carriage drove over from the crossroads and stopped in front of her. Zio happened to be at a station. Glancing at the double-decker that stopped on the iron tracks, Zio took out a few pennies, walked over, and sat down by the window. Such public carriages could seat nearly 50 people with its double decks. It wasn't too crowded, allowing Zio to easily observe the scenery outside. However, she didn't admire the scenery. Her mind was quickly outlining the exact appearance of her target: brown hair, red eyes, pronounced features, a nose bridge that was so high that it looked deformed, and an oil painting catalog in hand. With her supernatural senses as a sheriff, as well as the distance between them not being too great, Zio could vaguely grasp her target's current location and predetermined destination. Therefore, she remained very calm and even took off her cap while using the glass windows to tidy up her coarse and stubborn blonde hair. After several stations, Zio suddenly got up when the public carriage came to a stop as she alighted. This was the Backlund Bridge area. She had sensed that the target had already changed direction and was preparing to head towards the bridge. Zio immediately went on foot, planning to enter another street at the bend up ahead to board the public carriage that headed for the south bank of the Tussock River. She had good luck, with a public carriage driving over just as she arrived at the stop. Zio silently exhaled and took out another batch of pennies she had prepared, her urge to buy a bike strengthened. This tracked carriage was very crowded, but with her domineering aura as an arbiter, she was able to easily pass through the crowd, head up to the upper deck, and find a seat. The carriage moved slowly as Zio casually looked out the window when her gaze suddenly froze. She saw Sherman, who she hadn't been able to find anywhere. This young man who thought himself as a woman was carrying a paper bag with a few long loaves of bread and a stack of newspapers as he entered a narrow alley. His brown shoulder-length hair had grown longer, and his gray-patterned trousers seemed tighter. Although his figure disappeared almost as quickly as he appeared, making it impossible for the average person to notice, Biyao, who was a sheriff, easily made the necessary judgment. Sherman stopped renting his place in Eastborough and moved here. Seeing that Sherman was fine and that she was still tracking her target, she held back her urge to jump off the carriage to chase after him to ask him about his recent situation. Sherman carried the paper bag with several long loaves of bread and a stack of papers as he passed through alleys and streets, making a huge detour before entering an apartment building. He followed the cramped stairs to the third story, took out a key, and opened the door to where he lived. He seemed to possess some pretty good anti-tracking skills. With a creak, the door opened as Sherman's eyes lit up. He saw a lady wearing a black dress in front of him. This lady had a sweet, supple face and an impeccable figure. Even while standing at the window and blocking out the sunlight, making herself become cloaked in the shadows, she seemed to be gilded, making her appear holy and beautiful. "Why are you here?" Sherman stared at her in surprise but couldn't help but size her up. His unobvious Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed a mouthful of saliva. The next second, he turned his head and looked to the side as though he didn't dare look at her head-on. "Ma'am T. Trissy," Sherman stammered a greeting. Trissy slowly smiled as she allowed the poorly lit room to appear to become brighter. Then, she asked with a teasing tone, "Why don't you dare to look at me?" I don't know. One like men. Why do I still have odd thoughts when looking at you?" Sherman continued looking at the ground to his side as he stammered an answer. Trissy's expression immediately turned mixed before smiling as though nothing had happened. Females can also appreciate the charm of beauty within their gender. She paused for a moment before saying, "I came here today because I have a mission for you. Your original progress has been very fast, leaving me very satisfied. But it seems like it has recently stopped." Sherman's face immediately wore a look of horror as he subconsciously took a step back. I don't think there's a need to do such things." Seeing Trissy silent, Sherman's gradually eloquently stringed his words. "I really don't wish to instigate others into stealing, robbing, and murdering. That's too evil, too despicable. Even at the very beginning, those people you got me to assassinate seemed to be a little overboard. Although they had indeed cursed me, beat me, ostracized me, and spread bad rumors about me, using all kinds of means to harm me in exchange for joy, their actions didn't require them to pay with their lives." Unsurprised, Trissy smiled and said, "That's not what you said back then. You hated them and had wicked feelings for them. Once you obtained beyond your powers, you were so eager to seek revenge on them. I just made a tiny suggestion, and you planned several assassination missions. I always remember how you looked stained with blood, trembling in excitement and fervor." Sherman couldn't help but retreat as he heard that until he was stopped by the door which had closed at some point in time. He then covered his face with his hands, shouting, "No. I have nightmares every night, dreaming of them surrounding me, covered in blood. They chase after me, bite me, paw." The paper bag fell to the ground as the long loaves of bread were scattered. The stack of newspapers happened to drop just beside them. "This is very normal." Trissy cut off Sherman. "This is a necessary psychological change for an assassin. Think about it. Didn't you wish to kill them when they were bullying you?" "Yes," Sherman answered hesitantly. Trissy then chuckled. "Just treat it as self-defense when being bullied, thus, killing them." Her speech had a natural allure that made one wish to listen and believe. Sherman rapidly calmed down and nodded. "From this point of view, it does seem much better." Upon hearing that, Trissy's dimples appeared as she teasingly added, "Besides, they weren't your match when they were alive, so what's there to be afraid of when they're dead? Even if they become ghosts or specters, it's nothing. You just need to seriously complete the ritual and consume one more potion, and then you'll be able to burn all those souls to oblivion. But I can't bear seeing people turn ugly, crazy, and evil under my acts of instigation." Sherman still seemed rather unwilling. Trissy indiscernibly curled the ends of her lips as she said with her smile maintained, "Those are evil thoughts they had to begin with. It has nothing to do with you. Even without you, those evil thoughts will erupt at specific moments and situations. Also, the missions I arranged for you are all related to the gangs. Aren't you most aware of what those people are like? Getting them to fracture and kill one another is mercy and kindness for people like you and the innocent people of Eastboro." Sherman subconsciously widened his mouth, swallowing the words he was just about to say. He instantly fell silent. Trissy's eyes swept past him and continued with a soothing voice, "You're just one step away from your target. As long as you complete the remaining ritual, you can drink the third potion to completely become a woman. When that happens, you can use the name Shermaine that you've already picked for yourself. What a nice sounding name it is, isn't it? Then, you can leave Backland as a woman, heading for Mid-Seashire or Desi Bay where you can begin a brand new life. You will no longer have anything to do with this place. Yes, you will definitely be filled with charm. Many excellent men will court you, and you can choose the one you like the most and are most satisfied with, walking down the aisle in a cathedral. You will have bubbly kids, and you can bring them up to be healthy children. You can bring them to Winter County for skiing, Desi Bay for holidays, and to the hunting grounds which are pleasures that only nobles have. Didn't you say that you were willing to do anything to regain your true self?" Sherman's lips quivered, and after pursing them tightly for a while, he separated them and said, "Ma'am Trissy, I understand. I will proceed according to your instructions." After saying that, he seemed to lose all his strength as he stumbled to the ground. He subconsciously reached out to hold onto a coat rack beside him. During this process, his gaze happened to sweep past the stack of newspapers. It had already spread apart, revealing a particular report. Tycoon from Desi, Mr. Dwayne Dantes, shows interest in purchasing the Larryway Steel Company, believing that it has excellent profitability and a promising future. "Sir, are you really planning on buying Larryway Steel Company?" Anani asked while walking upstairs at 160 Buckland Street. Dwayne Dantes shook his head and smiled. "That news is just pure fabrication. I've only met the owner of the Larryway Steel Company, Mr. Phil Larivi, at a ball last week and had a chat." By the side, Butler Walter heaved a sigh of relief as he warned, "Sir, the Larryway Steel Company is indeed seeking a buyer. There are quite a number of people who are considering the option. That also means that this piece of news was released by the reporters under Phil's instructions so that he can sell it at a better price?" Klein nodded in thought. He entered the room with the half balcony and prepared to head up above the gray fog. He wanted to use Anuni's praying point of light to see any abnormalities at Hazel's place. This was something that he had been doing daily for the past few days. Chapter 1000 Prelude in the Grand Palace above the gray fog. Through Anuni's prayer point of light, Klein saw the scene inside his valet's room. As his vision pulled out and slowly extended out, he began taking in all of Buckland Street. Among buildings covered in fresh flowers and grass, Intis parasol trees that shielded the sunlight slowly swept past. There were slow-moving carriages that were elegantly or beautifully adorned, and youths dashing quickly on bikes. Finally, Klein locked onto Unit 39, Member of Parliament Mock's residence. He then lowered his field of view and began observing every animal and human to see if there was any black-haired, black-eyed, monocle-wearing man. Phew. There's no switching or grafting of fate. Nearly 10 minutes later, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. At this moment, a carriage drove into Mock's residence and stopped at their doorstep. A young lady with curly black-green hair and bright, dark brown eyes alighted from a carriage. It was none other than Hazel who had returned home. She was wearing a dark green dress that didn't expose her shoulders. Her lips were slightly pursed, and she wore a relaxed look with a hint of joy. Upon seeing Hazel in such a state, Klein's heart skipped a beat. This was definitely abnormal. From Klein's point of view, the rat demigod had only two outcomes after meeting Amon's avatar. She either had a trump card and managed to escape successfully at the cost of being heavily injured, or she had turned into a Beyonder characteristic to strengthen Amon's avatar. And regardless of the outcome, there was no way Hazel could find her teacher. She would definitely be in grief and pain, feeling dispirited and sad. So how could she be relaxed and happy? With her taking the risk to head to the manor in the suburbs to inform her teacher, she's not a cold and selfish person. Her present state indicates that she has confirmed that her teacher, that rat demigod, is fine. She has even been rewarded, perhaps obtaining all kinds of knowledge about the supernatural world. This is in conflict with my theory of the rat demigod's outcome. No, it's not in conflict. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Klein leaned back into his seat and came to a conclusion. Amon had not only obtained the rat demigod's Beyonder characteristic, but he had also stolen her fate and had replaced her identity. Therefore, to Hazel, her teacher hadn't encountered any mishaps and would only need a period of time to lie low. After making the confirmation, Klein silently exhaled and felt a little relaxed. To him, the most terrifying aspect of Amon was that no one knew what form or identity he would use to appear. It could be possible that Member of Parliament Mocked would one day wear a monocle, or that insects in the garden would turn around with monocles on their faces. Therefore, after grasping the identity Amon might use to appear, Klein couldn't help but feel more assured. As for Amon's performance being problematic in front of Hazel, Klein believed that it was impossible. After all, Amon was a king of angels that was fundamentally good at deceit. Even if he mentioned something that differed from what the rat demigod had said, he could easily use the excuse of it being a test with what he now said being part of her formal education to fool her. Of course, based on Palaz Zoros's depiction, Amon definitely wouldn't appear as a rat demigod, so I shouldn't be careless. Klein did some observations before retracting his gaze and leaving the gray fog. Inside his room, he sat on a reclining chair and drank some black tea with a lemon slice. He half closed his eyes and considered how he could deepen his relationship with Conas Kilgore. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly opened his eyes and activated his spirit vision. At the demigod level, he could already activate it at will. Almost at the same moment, Rionette Tinker walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. One of them had a letter in its mouth. "Whose letter is it?" Klein asked as he reached out his right hand. "Sharon," Rionette Tinker's other head answered. "Miss Sharon? She should be making her final preparations for the advancement. Why would she suddenly write to me?" Klein was slightly puzzled as he received the envelope. After he opened it, he found very little content. There was only a simple line: Emlyn White is seeking out the Rose School of Thought. Emlyn is seeking out the Rose School of Thought. Klein pricked up his brows in surprise. His opinion of Emlyn was a sanguine who was afraid of trouble. Unless necessary, he didn't even wish to head out. So how could he actively search for the Rose School of Thought? This definitely isn't Emlyn's own will. Yes, Emlyn had mentioned that some important figure of the Sanguine was meeting him. This is a new mission that the Sanguine gave him? It's very possible. However, why didn't he mention it in the Tarot Club? Oh, it was focused on the punishment operation, and he had other clues, so he temporarily kept it from us? Klein thought as he leaned forward. Under the watch of Miss Messenger's 8 eyes, he took out a piece of paper and a fountain pen from his coffee table. He wasn't curious about Emlyn's clues, because it was an obvious matter. Since Miss Sharon knew that Emlyn was seeking out the Rose School of Thought and had asked their mutual friend, Detective Sherlock Moriarty, about this matter, it meant that this Sanguine had likely asked the help of the black market arms dealer, Ian, from the Bravehearts bar. This also meant that, in Emlyn's previous commissions, he must have noticed Sharon or Merrick, otherwise, it was impossible for him to mention the Rose School of Thought to an ordinary person. I don't know enough about the apothecary pathway. I can't determine how Emlyn discovered a wraith or zombie. Klein crossed his right leg as he placed the letter on his thigh and began scribbling. This is likely a mission the Sanguine's upper echelons gave Emlyn. They hate the Rose School of Thought members who believe in the primordial moon, and they have directed this anger at the other factions of the Rose School of Thought. Upon writing this, Klein paused and added, I suspect that the Mother Tree of Desire has the intention of encroaching onto the authority of the Moon domain, but I'm unsure why the primordial Moon believers would join the Rose School of Thought. This secret existence seems to have a very complicated relationship with the Mother Tree of Desire. They are at odds, but they have also cooperated. It's hard to tell. Putting down his pen and folding the letter, Klein looked at Miss Messenger who had been waiting. He asked with a chortle, "How did you know that I'll be replying?" One of Rionette Tinker's heads succinctly answered, "Inkling." Right on the heels of that, the four blonde, red-eyed heads spoke one after another. "You seem a little livelier recently. Your expression has also become much richer." As Klein pulled out the box that was connected to his golden pocket watch, he took out a gold coin from it and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Repeatedly wearing a thick mask isn't good for one's mental health. I realized that after becoming a demigod. Therefore, unless he was in situations where he needed to disguise or hide his feelings, he limited the use of his clown's power to control his emotions." Rionette Tinker didn't say a word as the heads bit on the gold coin and letter before vanishing. Watching Miss Messenger leave, Klein leaned back slightly and inwardly muttered, "I wonder if Miss Sharon and Merrick will use the Sanguine to deal with the Rose School of Thought members in Backlund. Miss Sharon is probably focusing her time and efforts on her advancement. She might not involve herself, but I can't be sure about Merrick." Emlyn changed into his Church of Earth Mother priest robes, and then wore a red coat and a silk hat before walking out the Harvest Church. He then got into a rental carriage by the roadside. After saying his destination, he casually cast his gaze out the window. At this moment, Emlyn sensed something as he abruptly moved his body, leaving shadowy afterimages in his wake as he moved to the side. Then, he saw a figure appear out of nowhere. It was a young man whose coat wasn't buttoned, revealing the white shirt and black vest within. His brown hair was a little moist and messy as though he hadn't combed it in a while. His brown eyes were filled with temperance, as though he was restraining certain urges deep within his heart. Upon seeing this pale corpse-like face, Emlyn tipped his chin and said with a smile, showing no signs of nervousness, "You have finally come. Aren't you afraid that I'm a member of the Rose School of Thought that's here to finish you off?" The young man's figure turned somewhat transparent. Emlyn scoffed and said, "Would I not be aware of the Rose School of Thought's history? Or matters about the betrayal of the Temperance faction and their escape?" "Well, how do I address you?" "Merrick," the young man replied. "Is this the information you received from the upper echelons of the Sanguine?" Emlyn was taken aback as he'd sked. "You are smarter than I thought." He used such a remark to confirm the other party's guess. Merrick slowly drew a breath and leaned forward slightly. "How did you notice our existence from Ian's side?" Emlyn leisurely leaned back into the carriage and said with a smile, "Humans have the smell of humans. Wraiths have the smell of wraiths." Merrick fell silent for a few seconds before asking, "You Sanguine wish to deal with the Rose School of Thought members in Backlund?" "The important members," Emlyn replied by making an emphasis. "If that's the case, we can use ourselves as bait to help you fish out the Rose School of Thought members. However, I need confirmation." Merrick rubbed his eyes and said directly, "I know you are unable to make the decision. You can first return to seek permission from the Sanguine. After you obtain their assurance, you know where to find us." Having said that, he handed a dossier in his hand. "This is from Ian. It's the initial feedback from tracking Ernst Boyar. Many bounty hunters have completed this together." Emlyn received the dossier and nodded in a rare look of solemnity. "Okay." Chapter 1001 First movement. When the wraith in front of him was gone, Emlyn White retracted his gaze, untied the thread on the dossier, and pulled out the documents inside. As he read through them, Emlyn had a rough idea of Ernst Boyar's routine. This Sanguine Viscount had a routine which was rather random, staying at home, out visiting exhibitions, partaking in wine tasting at manors in the city outskirts, shopping at department stores with female companions, or sketching female models. He was like the typical wealthy man. However, Ernst had recently been visiting St. George Borough every other day to monitor the renovations of the furniture factory he had invested in. It was a bid to ensure that it could quickly resume work. This way, the sanguine Viscount's lifestyle became repetitive. The places he visited, the paths he took, and the places he had lunch were repeated every other day. Emlyn pressed down on his temples, seriously filtering out 3 venues which were suitable for the operation. The first was inside or at the entrance of the furniture factory owned by Ernst Boyar. The second was St. Hierland Square, where he stopped along the way home for a meal and to feed birds. The third place was Backlund Bridge. Unless Ernst was willing to take a huge detour, he had to pass by this area when traveling between his home and St. George Borough. These 3 spots meet the requirement of having plenty of people, making it chaotic. However, Backlund Bridge has too few entrances and exits. With the 2 ends locked down, one can only leave by jumping into the river, an act only chosen by idiots. St. Hierland Square comes under St. Hierland Cathedral, core to the Church of Steam in Backlund, and even the entirety of Lone. It's akin to the Second Holy See. It meets Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion. It can effectively prevent conflicts from escalating, and it can interfere with any subsequent divination and investigations. Emlyn gradually had an inclination. And once a living being had an inclination, they would unknowingly seek more reasons to affirm their choice, and Emlyn was no exception, without a doubt. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that St. Hierland Square met almost all the requirements. First, Ernst wouldn't stay in the area for too long. He would have lunch at a restaurant with Civilaus cuisine since he was born in Civilaus County. Secondly, there were several tracked carriage stops in the vicinity, making the area filled with traffic on foot. With most of them being people from the lower or middle class, accidents often happened. Thirdly, with it as the origin, one would enter the area south of the bridge if one didn't head to the Backlund Bridge. It would then be close by to the Harvest Church. Finally, at noon, the St. Hierland Cathedral would spew steam, turn its levers, and chime a clock. It was inevitable for everyone's attention to be attracted. It's confirmed. Emlyn quickly made up his mind. Raising his right hand and adjusting his bow tie, his red eyes were filled with anticipation. At this moment, he suddenly frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. St. Hierland Square was just perfect for the job. It was so suitable that almost all the conditions were met. Will Ernst be wary against my revenge? Why would he allow himself to stay in such an environment for such long periods of time? Even if he's stupid enough to not realize it, wouldn't the Earls warn him? The corners of Emlyn's mouth curled up slightly as he understood the reason. St. Hierland Square was the venue the sanguine upper echelons had designated for him. Heh! Emlyn chuckled, keeping his mouth curled. He decided to request Mr. Fool to have a gathering for the few members and also invite Mr. Hanged Man to discuss the plan in detail. This was different from the framework that they had previously decided upon. They needed to consider every detail and consider every problem. At 15 minutes to 12, St. George Borough, St. Hierland Square. In a private room on the 3rd story of a restaurant northwest of the square. A figure stood in front of the window, holding a cup filled with scarlet blood-like liquid. He was leisurely looking at the fountain nearby and the crowds that came and went. He was a lanky person, wearing a formal suit meant for banquets. His light-colored hair that was nearly silver and his bright red eyes combined together to give him a sense of coquettish handsomeness. There was a constant faint smile lining his lips. My lord, will it really be fine? Emlyn seems to be different from before. This can be seen from his recent hunt of the primordial moon believers. A middle-aged man in a dark suit walked to the window and said with some hint of worry. The man who had been politely addressed cast his gaze at the square where Emlyn White stood. He was listening to a violinist busking on the street as he chuckled. Our preparations are enough even against a demigod, much less a kid who hasn't even become a viscount. Besides, we don't really plan on doing anything serious. Our only goal is to identify and make confirmations. This is a lot simpler than preventing certain people from escaping. As he spoke, the man with the light hair and bright red eyes raised his right hand slightly, rotating the ring on his left ring finger. The ring was made of silver, and embedded in it was a strange gem with a ghostly blue hue. On a carriage driving towards St. Hierland Square, Ernst Boyar had his right hand over his left. He naturally rotated the ring on his ring finger that had a ghostly blue gem embedded in it. He casually looked out the window and saw a trackless carriage slowly drive over from afar. A paperboy slightly taller than 160 centimeters had a sling bag across his chest as he peddled his papers along the street. Quite a number of bicycles had replaced the carriages that were often seen last year. They darted through the crowds in St. George Borough. Here, the number of workers wearing light blue or grayish-blue uniforms with hats had far exceeded the number of people in formal suits and top hats. Ernst retracted his gaze as he chuckled. He had no fear about what would happen next. He even looked forward to it. He believed that he had made enough preparations. He wore Oath of Rose on his left hand. It allowed him to share what he saw, heard, and smelled with Earl Mistral from a distance away. It made sure that nothing would go wrong while ensuring that their objective was met. In his inner pocket where his silver pocket watch was, there was a moon paper figurine. These could suffer a single lethal blow or an attack that targeted his soul body. It ensured that he wouldn't suffer any serious injuries or death within a short span of time. He also wore Alcohol Nemesis, a diamond brooch. It kept him brimming with energy with lucidity in his thoughts. It raised his resistance against spells that acted on the body of heart and mind. By his waist was a belt named Moonlight Sash. It could effectively reduce sun and lightning damage. These mystical items were the accumulation of Ernst's wealth or were bestowed by Earl Mistral. It made sure that Ernst was a target that could hardly be quickly finished off or controlled. With the Sanguine Viscount's natural resistance against nightmare-type influences, Ernst was nearly without weakness. Even against a demigod, he could put up a fight as long as the latter didn't reveal their mythical creature form. The only problem is that the negative effects of all these mystical items are quite excessive. Ernst's facial muscles twitched, but he quickly composed himself. The Oath of Rose would make his thoughts appear in Earl Mistral's mind from time to time. And if he kept wearing it for a week without removing it, the pair who had the matching rings might very well end up in love, regardless of gender or race. Moon paper figurine was an expendable item. It had nearly zero side effects apart from making the body slightly cold. The Alcohol Nemesis brooch's problem was that it would deal continuous damage to one's liver and brain. If it was worn for excessively long periods of time, it might result in one losing one's thoughts and logical reasoning. Therefore, one had to take it off for 15 minutes after every half an hour of equipping it. Once Moonlight Sash was worn, it made all senses much sharper, making it easy for one to see and hear things one shouldn't see or hear. At the same time, the wearer would feel itchy at intermittent intervals. Let's hope they don't cower in fear and that this doesn't drag on. Ernst Boyar checked on his condition once again, casting his gaze of anticipation at the St. Hierland Square's entrance nearby. On the other end of St. Hierland Square, Emlyn White, who was taking in the sights of the buskers on the streets, suddenly looked up at a bird that flew over. Following that, he raised his hand to press down on his top hat. Bowing his head slightly, he briskly walked to the middle of the square, approaching the fountain. In this process, Emlyn's figure kept moving as he mixed into the crowd. However, this failed to avoid Earl Mistral's tracking. This sanguine earl with silver hair rotated the ghostly blue gem ring on his left ring finger and coldly said, "Take note." At the entrance of St. Hierland Square, Ernst Boyar grew increasingly pumped. He knew that the operation was about to come finally. Emlyn still chose St. Hierland Square after all. Ernst cast his gaze out the window once more, warily watching the pedestrians on the street, the trackless public carriages that were about to pass him, the ordinary paperboy who was peddling his papers, and the elegant windows of the surrounding houses and shops. He didn't believe that Emlyn's potential partners were hiding in there, because there were even more, better spots in St. Hierland Square that made it conducive to take action. However, he still kept up the required level of wariness. Suddenly, his body lunged forward slightly as he nearly got out of his seat. The carriage he was on had stopped without any warning. Right on the heels of that, the horses that pulled the carriage seemed to be in a nightmare as they raised their front hooves, struggling wildly, flipping the carriage to the ground. During this process, Ernst Boyar actually had ample space, time, and strength to help the carriage driver control the berserk horse. However, he didn't do so, because he saw a transparent wolf-shaped specter jump over from outside the window. It had thrown a rose within its body. A rose. Ernst Boyar's eyes widened as the carriage toppled. He hurriedly jumped to the side and out the carriage as he made an illusory and incorporeal black chain extend out of the void. It wrapped around the wolf-shaped specter. With a soft poof, the wolf-shaped specter dissipated without a struggle. And when Ernst Boyar found his footing, he stood there motionless, his eyes turbid. He had already been pulled into a deep sleep. In a trackless public carriage that passed him by, a black-haired, green-eyed young man wore a thin trench coat. His back was facing the middle of the street as he focused on reading a notebook with a green bronze hardcover. Around him, the other passengers were either reading the papers or chatting. Some were looking out only to see the berserk horse quickly recover. With a whoosh, the black-haired, green-eyed man flipped the page of the notebook. The trackless carriage continued forward and gradually distanced itself. Chapter 1002 Second Movement St. Hierland Square, in the northwestern corner, at the third story of a restaurant. When the wolf spectre with the rose appeared in front of Ernst Boyar, the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Mistral retracted his gaze from Ernst Boyar. Darkness suffused from behind him as countless tiny bats flew within. Bribe. Just as this sanguine earl silently muttered this single word, he saw the toppled carriage, heard the neighing of the horse, and smelled all kinds of smells. However, he wasn't able to instantly find the origin of the disturbance and accident. At this moment, his vision darkened as his eyes seemed to lose the ability to take in light. The din in his ears also halted. Earl Mistral chortled inwardly as he immediately fused with the bats behind him, rematerializing beside Ernst Boyar. Suddenly, in his black vision, a point of light appeared. This point of light rapidly expanded as it grew brighter and brighter. A golden figure with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings walked out of it. The pairs of wings spread out, blanketing Mistral's vision, causing light and darkness to mix. This created mysterious and complicated symbols that didn't differentiate themselves within the golden figure. It was both holy and corrupted, both light and dark. Angel. Mistral's pupils widened slightly as he couldn't help but take a step back, terminating his previous thoughts. In confusion, Ernst Boyar rapidly snapped awake when he saw a pair of limpid eyes that resembled crystalline gems or a lake. He felt a copy of the newspapers being stuffed into his hand. In those emerald green eyes were ripples. Deep within the emanating ripples were twirls of a vortex that seemed to suck in the soul of anyone who lay their eyes on them. Ernst Boyar instantly became engrossed in it as he couldn't move his eyes away. Then, he heard a gentle and ethereal female voice in his ears. Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White. Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White. This voice was layered as it resounded within Ernst Boyar's ears. It drilled into his brain, sinking deep into his heart. Ernst Boyar nodded in a daze, sensing that there was more, but he couldn't hear it clearly. The paperboy with a sling bag diagonally across his shoulders swiftly turned around and agilely passed through the bicycles, mixing into the crowd that came and went. This boy had a pretty face as his messy hair drooped down and hid his brows. As he walked, he took off a black fishnet glove that he had worn at some point in time, stuffing it into his sling bag filled with newspapers. As the wind blew, his clothes shrank as a spot on his exposed arm protruded out. A few seconds later, Ernst Boyar suddenly jumped back from where he stood, doing so as though he had been trying to dodge something. No good. I was influenced by a nightmare's ability. Just as he found his footing, his pupils dilated as he looked around his surroundings in a state of high alert, prepared for any impending attacks. Although Ernst Boyar was perplexed about how easily he was pulled into a dream, he knew that it wasn't time to consider the details. What followed next was key. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Ring. A few bicycles passed him as they used their bells to warn the gentleman in the middle of the road to make way. Ernst Boyar narrowed his eyes as he glared at him, his muscles under his clothes ready to deliver their might. I.e., these few bicycles circled around him as the pedestrians came and went, some slowing down their footsteps and pointing their fingers. Gong. 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 12 gongs were heard as the white steam spewed out from the chimneys of St. Ireland Cathedral. The holy hymns of praise resounded as the gears and levers got to work. On the square, everyone stopped in their footsteps. At that holy moment, they either closed their eyes in prayer or were listening silently, regardless of whether they were believers of the god of steam and machinery or not. Only the pigeons that were being fed flew up and soared into the sky. Gong gong. Gong. As the gongs sounded, no one moved. Even Earl Mistral, who was inside a private room at the restaurant, stood there motionless with a heavy expression. His vision had already recovered, but all he saw was workers wearing grayish-blue or light blue clothes and bicycles of the same make. Apart from that, he discovered nothing. Furthermore, Ernst Boyar hadn't been injured at all. Of course, he had guessed that the paperboy was problematic from the newspaper in the Sanguine Viscount's hand. However, he didn't attempt to carry out a pursuit. Clearly, the power that had borrowed the level of an angel didn't belong to a low or mid-sequence beyonder. This also meant that Emlyn White's faction had at least a demigod hidden in the vicinity. Mistral believed that once he took action, he was bound to be stopped or even incur retaliation. In a situation of being easily detected while not knowing where his opponents were hiding, Mistral believed that it spelled trouble. Carrying out a pursuit in such cases only exacerbated the matter. Furthermore, to the Sanguine, this was only a test. If the faction backing Emlyn had mobilized a demigod, they could detain that powerhouse thanks to Ernst Boyar's protective measures. And through Oath of Rose, Mistral could confirm the attacker's identity. They had never thought of escalating the matter into an intense conflict. In their plans, it only involved Earl Mistral stopping the other party to prevent Ernst Boyar from suffering any harm. In the present situation, they had lost the initiative. To forcefully carry out a pursuit might highly likely result in a demigod's battle. And in Backlund, around St. Ireland Cathedral, this was equivalent to suicide. Besides, to Mistral, since the other demigod hadn't personally taken action and had only provided auxiliary help, to personally take action and make a pursuit would be a loss of decorum and an insult to his reputation as a sanguine earl. Humph. I want to see what happens next. Mistral's facial muscles twitched as he rotated the ghostly blue ring on his left hand once more. After the 12 gongs, Emlyn started walking again. He circled past the fountain and arrived at the other end of St. Ireland Square amidst the landing pigeons. He then saw Ernst Boyar, who had his back hunched slightly, afraid to even move half a step. He saw the toppled carriage, the horse that was flicking its tail, and the carriage driver who wore a look of pain. Emlyn walked over, took out a wallet, and pulled out £100. He handed it to the carriage driver and said, "This is your compensation." Ah. The carriage driver wore a blank but pleasantly surprised look. The rental carriage wasn't his. He was only an ordinary employee. After the carriage was damaged because of the horse being startled, he experienced a brief moment of feeling the pinch. Following that, it was anxiousness and despair that ruled over his mind. Based on the so-called contract and other similar accidents he had seen over the years, he was responsible for all of this. This meant compensation from him and, with his income and family situation, meant bankruptcy. During that short moment, all kinds of thoughts had surfaced in the carriage driver's mind. They were mainly of 3 types. One was to scare the frozen gentleman and get him to pay compensation. This prevented his family from falling apart, with his children having to slave away at the factories at a young age. Another option was to immediately bring the horse to a gangster and sell it. Then, he would return home and leave Backlund with his wife and children. The last option was to arrange for his family to move from the place they rented. He would then plead with the owner of the carriage, hoping that he could repay it in installments. If the person wasn't agreeable, he would rather be thrown into jail than reimburse him a single penny. Now, having £100 suddenly hit him left his mind groggy. He was at a loss for words. £100 was enough to buy a brand new rental carriage and even more. Emlyn ignored the carriage driver and looked at Ernst. Everything's fine now. Aren't you the biggest problem? How can it be fine with you here? Ernst lampooned as he rotated the ring with the ghostly blue gem on his left hand. For some unknown reason, he felt that he should believe Emlyn White and even approach him. Emlyn shot a glance, suddenly turned around, and walked briskly into an alley. Ernst subconsciously opened up his stride and followed closely behind. He kept holding on to the newspaper in hand. The two sanguine moved at extremely fast speeds, with one running and the other chasing. However, they didn't dare reveal anything extraordinary. When Earl Mistral sensed that the two sanguine were beyond the reach of his spirituality, he used the connection between the paired oath of rose rings to follow behind unhurriedly. Emlyn occasionally made detours, taking shortcuts and occasionally returning to spots they had been before. It made it difficult to guess where his destination was. As for Ernst, he was like a bull having seen a red cloth. He refused to give up as he followed closely behind. Unknowingly, the two sanguine arrived at Rose Street, which was south of the bridge. At this moment, Emlyn suddenly sped up. He wasn't afraid that others saw him producing afterimages as he dashed right into the Harvest Church. Ernst did the same. Not good. From afar, Earl Mistral was just about to descend upon them to stop the subsequent developments when Ernst's figure vanished inside the Harvest Church's entrance. Gotcha! A tile at Mistral's foot instantly shattered. After entering the cathedral, Ernst came to a realization. He then saw a figure wearing a brown priest robe stand up at the front of all the rows of pews. He appeared like a mountain. At the same time, the entire cathedral turned heavy as if it was a jail. It seemed to fuse with the land itself. Ernst's mind buzzed immediately as another voice sounded in his mind. After you awaken from the first hypnosis, throw all the items on you to Emlyn White. Amidst shuffling sounds, Ernst took off his sash, threw out the brooch, and slammed the various items towards Emlyn White. This included his silver pocket watch and a wallet filled with cash. Pa! The newspaper in his hand fell to the ground, throwing out a paper card that was stuffed within. On the paper card was the goddess of justice sitting on a chair and holding a sword and scale. It was the tarot card, Justice. Chapter 1003. Ritornello. After throwing everything other than his clothes, Ernst Boyar was stunned for a moment before he snapped to his senses. What am I doing? What did I do? This sanguine viscount finally recalled the matters he had deliberately forgotten, those pair of emerald green, limpid eyes. A psychological cue, no, hypnosis. Ernst Boyar looked around in anger and irresistible horror, instinctively taking in the situation he was in. His gaze then landed on the mountain-like figure. He saw Father Yutravsky with his thin and sparse brows. Instantly, Ernst Boyar had all sorts of thoughts run through his mind and collide with one another. He quickly came up with one intense thought. He didn't put up any resistance, and he immediately said, I'll come here to do a month of volunteer work. Emlyn's predicament had long been spread amongst the sanguine in Backlund. Ernst Boyar was well aware of Father Yutravsky and knew that, even if he were to put up a fight, it was difficult for him to escape the fate of doing volunteer work. He might as well surrender and choose conditions that were more beneficial to him. At the very least, I shouldn't have any cues planted in my mind and end up converting my faith to Earth Mother. This thought flashed through Ernst's mind. He discovered a lantern in Yutravsky's hand, and inside it was a strange candle that seemed to be covered in human skin with protruding lumps. Under the candlelight's faint illumination, Ernst's pupils widened again. He only had one thought on his mind remaining as it kept resonating, another psychological cue. At that moment, he felt the gloominess thicken in his heart. All right, Yutravsky nodded and agreed to Ernst Boyar's request. Emlyn held back his smugness and pleased smile. He then looked at the items he had caught, looking like a farmer who had just reaped a bountiful harvest. In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square, the lights darkened as a huge shadow appeared. Tiny bats flew out of the darkness and quickly clumped together. Smoke rose up as the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Earl Mistral appeared at the spot where the bats had appeared. Everything around him had been restored to normal. His servant, a middle-aged man in a dark formal suit, immediately stepped forward and asked with a bow, "My lord, are you having your meal now?" He couldn't tell if things had happened smoothly, or if something had gone wrong, much less about the success of the outcome from the Earl's face. However, he didn't dare inquire. Mistral nodded and said, "Yes." He walked to the table with a composed look, took off the ring with the ghostly blue gem, and sat down without showing a chink in his disposition. It was as though he had headed out to feed the pigeons. This rich smell is rather unique, but it's not bad. In the private room neighboring Earl Mistral, Klein was wearing a very ordinary face as he commented on the Civilhouse cuisine delicacy, lamb tripe. This punishment operation was an attempt by the few members of the Tarot Club, one that didn't need the world or Mr. Fool's interference, but considering how Miss Justice and the Moon Emlyn had zero experience in such matters and lacked experience in other matters, he had come to the area incognito as a final safeguard. He had previously used his marionette to pray to the Fool while he entered the attached bathroom of his private room to head above the grey fog. Using the corresponding point of light, he had taken in the entire square and its surroundings. He kept holding the sea god's scepter the entire time, prepared to deliver a lightning strike to prevent any problems once he discovered anything amiss. However, he ultimately didn't do a thing. Everything happened more smoothly than he imagined. There was no need for him to consider the experience the star Leonard, but Miss Justice, who was participating in such matters for the first time, had exceeded his expectations. She wasn't nervous at all, not showing any signs of panic. Indeed. A sequence 6 of the spectator pathway is far greater than low and mid-sequence beyonders of the other pathways when it comes to controlling emotions. Even if she felt uneasy, she would have resolved it with her beyonder powers before the operation. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he continued sampling the other delicacies. Outside the window, on St. Hireland Square, it became filled with lively music, an eclectic mix of the flute, violin, accordion, and 7-string guitar. A rental carriage was slowly circling around the perimeter of St. Hireland Square. Leonard Mitchell, who was prepared to return to the north bank of the Backland Bridge, took one look at the pigeons in the middle of the square before asking with a suppressed voice, "Old man, what's your take regarding the outcome of this operation?" After he pulled Ernst Boyar into a dream, he flipped Lamino's travels and activated Angel's Embrace. He then left the scene on carriage, unsure of the subsequent developments. In his mind, Pallas Zoroast snapped back, "In the fourth epoch, there's such a saying, believe in the might of deities. This means that this matter has received the tacit approval of Mr. Fool, so it's bound to succeed?" However, Old Man doesn't know much about the Tarot Club. Mr. Fool is a witness most of the time, so there's no so-called tacit approval. Leonard mumbled inwardly before diverting the topic, "Why doesn't this saying feel complete?" He had never informed Pallas Zoroast of the exact situation of the Tarot Club. All he did was give mention of the general situation of the Tarot Club and inform him of the matters that had been approved by Mr. Fool. Pallas chuckled and said, "Indeed. There's also a second half of the saying, do not trust their benevolence. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust their benevolence." Leonard repeated in silence as he looked down at the notebook with a bronze hardcover. He then muttered wistfully, "This is really akin to a Grade 1 sealed artifact. Furthermore, resolving its negative effects is relatively simple." Before this operation, consideration was given to the fact that beyonders of the pathway involving the moon domain, as well as the darkness, had relatively stronger resistance against nightmare-related effects. Leonard had originally planned on borrowing Creeping Hunger from the world Klein Moretti. However, after some subsequent discussion, Miss Magician mentioned the traits of Lamino's travels, giving him a better option. Hence, Klein, who was originally responsible for Angel's Embrace, lent him Creeping Hunger for 3 hours. Various useful beyonder powers were recorded, such as bribe, weaken. This is something from the Abraham family, Pallas Zoroast said with a sigh. Leonard had long known of this as he nodded indiscernibly. He then asked, "Old man, do you have the means of weakening or controlling the negative effects of the mystical item I previously mentioned?" "You call that a mystical item? That's something that requires sealing." Pallas first reprimanded Leonard. Then, he said, "Didn't you say that it has a living characteristic? That makes it much easier to resolve." Leonard felt relieved as he cast his gaze out the window again, taking in the sight of St. Hireland Cathedral, which had parts resembling factories. In Phelps Street, Northborough, in the vicinity of St. Samuel Cathedral, at the entrance of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. After changing her clothes, Audrey got off a carriage like an ordinary girl. She had already gotten rid of her paperboy attire at a hotel room that had been prepared ahead of time. And that room was reserved by someone under Emlyn's instructions. It had nothing to do with her. At this moment, there were people coming and going at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation's entrance, but Audrey walked over without any hesitation. No one looked at her, as though she lived in another world. Audrey briskly walked into the foyer, went up to the second story, and headed for the director's office. And everyone who she walked past seemed to join her in playing a game, pretending as though they hadn't seen her. They weren't puzzled about why this unfamiliar girl was inside. Audrey was just about to enter the office when she suddenly heard a familiar voice inside. "Miss Audrey, this is the amount of donations we have gathered this week." Audrey couldn't help but curl the ends of her lips as she gently nudged the ajar door and walked in. Inside the office, a staff member was holding a stack of documents, showing it to the person behind the desk. Sitting behind the desk was a golden retriever with a pair of gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. It sat at the director's seat, casually flipping through the documents, and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." The staff member then took back the document and smiled at the golden retriever. "Then, I'll take my leave, Miss Audrey." Behind her, Audrey held back her laughter as she walked to the sofa. She silently watched the staff member leave without interrupting the golden retriever from reading the other documents. Susie seriously read the different documents, afraid that something wrong would happen to her acting, thus, affecting Audrey's matters. After a while, she suddenly looked around in puzzlement. "Audrey, are you back? How did you notice?" Audrey stood up from the sofa and appeared within Susie's sights. For this operation, she had specially spoken to Susie. She got the latter to replace her at work in the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Then, with the golden retriever in tow, she hypnotized all the staff members who would interact with her that day, making them treat Susie as Audrey. As for any possible visitors, she told her staff that there would only be guests in the afternoon. And the signal to snap out of the hypnosis was the cathedral bells at 2 in the afternoon. Susie jumped off the chair after seeing Audrey, saying in exasperation, "It's almost 2. "That's right." Audrey inwardly made a silly face as she rushed into the small lounge and changed into her clothes. She then used Li's flame-controlling powers to bum her previous disguise. After returning to her office and sitting at her seat, she felt completely relaxed. She clasped her hands together and lightly pursed her lips. To be frank, she had always been nervous. However, she had successfully cast placate on herself before the operation, preventing any slip-ups. It's quite interesting now that I reminisce over it. We even discussed how we would compensate those who were affected. Audrey, well done. A smile beamed on the blonde, green-eyed beauty as it grew brighter. After this operation, she realized that her hypnotist potion had digested by a significant amount. Furthermore, she had also confirmed one thing: the mystical item, Hand of Horror, which came with bribe, charm worked perfectly with hypnosis. Yes, I also learned that Mr. Moon's name is Emlyn White. He didn't bother hiding the matter, because he had to tell me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have achieved our goals. Yes. Perhaps just giving the name of the cathedral was enough, but that will still expose his identity. I'm still feeling some anxiety. I was too stiff when hypnotizing. I actually used words that were too direct during the first level of hypnosis. Audrey cast placate on her slightly agitated feelings as she reviewed the entire operation, hoping that she could draw from the experience and lessons of today. Gong! Gong! St. Samuel Cathedral's bells chimed, indicating that it was 2 in the afternoon. Many staff who were inside 22 Phelps Street at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation had their bodies tremble after hearing it. Following that, they continued with their work as though nothing had happened. Gong! Gong! Amidst the cathedral's bells, Klein, who had transformed back into Dwayne Dantes, once again walked to 160 Buckland Street's balcony and took in the situation of Mock's house. At this moment, a carriage passed by his residence's entrance and drove to the end of the street. Suddenly, Klein felt his perception trigger as a scene surfaced in his mind. A gray rat was leaning against the carriage's window, leisurely watching the street scenery. Chapter 1004 Third Movement Gray Rat. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't hesitate to turn back into his half-open room, leave the balcony, and enter the master bedroom. He then entered the bathroom. He moved at an adequate pace, doing so as though he had been repeating this entire process like a daily routine. Locking the bathroom's door, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and passed through the gray fog filled with ravings and roars, finally taking his seat on the high-back chair of the fool. And before this, he made his valet, Enuni, who was standing by the corridor, softly pray to see God Calvetua. Using the corresponding point of light, he beckoned for the sea god's scepter and began expanding his vision. He then locked onto the carriage that was driving towards Mock's residence, 39 Buckland Street. And this time, the person leaning against the glass window and leisurely taking in the scenery was no longer a gray rat but a young man wearing a silk top hat and black trench coat. He had black hair and black eyes. His face was thin with a broad forehead. He wore a crystal monocle and had a faint smile on his lips. He was none other than the blasphemer, the angel of time, son of the creator, Ammon. Although Klein was already mentally prepared, his anxiety made his entire body feel chilly. Ammon had clearly appeared in his original form, but after stealing the rat demigod's destiny, he appeared as a gray rat in everyone's eyes without incurring any suspicion. He and his brother, Angel of Imagination Adam, had certain powers which were similar. It left terror in the mind of others the more they thought about it, but it was intrinsically different. If not for the gray fog and not for my deeper control of this place, I wouldn't have discovered it either. Klein felt a mix of joy and alarm as he expanded his vision to seek out Ammon's avatars. Compared to the grafting of destiny, the signs of parasitizing was a lot clearer. However, Klein didn't notice anything this time. Be it the other passengers in the carriage, the horses that towed the carriage, or the surrounding trees and air, there wasn't any sign of parasitizing. This is different from what Leonard's grandpa said. Shouldn't the appearance of one Ammon mean the accompaniment of many more Ammons? He is clearly aware that he was discovered by a bizarro sorcerer of the Church of Evernight, and he suspects that Buckland Street is under surveillance. Therefore, he only sent a single avatar to investigate the situation. Klein frowned as he came up with theories. He was a little unsure of how to handle the current development. Of course, he recalled Palez Zoroast mentioning that as long as one avatar was resolved, he could eliminate all the Ammons in Buckland Street. And now, there was only one Ammon in Buckland Street, a perfect time to take action. I'll first hear what the expert's opinion is. Klein immediately conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow's figure at the other end of the long bronze table and made him reverently and piously pray. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform Leonard Mitchell that Ammon has appeared at 39 Buckland Street, but there's only one. While Gehrman Sparrow made the prayer, Klein didn't stop monitoring the carriage. He saw Hazel in a light-colored dress alight and enter her foyer. Ammon, who was wearing a monocle and black trench coat, walked behind her with complete composure. Despite not having any concealment, the servants didn't notice him at all. It was as though there was only air or some inconspicuous creature behind Miss Hazel. Occasionally, the female servants would look at the ground and jump in fright. Just as they were about to scream, they would forget what they were about to do after their mouths opened. Ammon passed through the foyer and walked up the stairs. Pinching the crystal monocle, Ammon stuffed his hands into his pockets. Ringed transparent worms began squirming out of his body as they crawled in every direction before vanishing. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He recalled Palaz Zorost's description of Amon's parasitizing power, a plague-like infection. Hazel had been in an excellent mood recently. This was because her teacher hadn't truly gone mad. Everything that happened previously was only a test, and she had passed it with flying colors. This made her gain plenty of knowledge about the supernatural world. She learned the essence of the potions and grasped the acting method. She also gained the opportunity to advance to cryptologist. She was currently a sequence 7 beyonder. So the world actually has such a magical side to it. I wonder when I can become a demigod and shake off my mortal coils. Hazel glanced at the hanging wall clock and rubbed her sunken tummy. She decided to get her mother to bring forward the high tea session today. After all, there weren't any guests. At noon, she had used the excuse of heading out for a meal to bring her teacher back. She also took the opportunity to act and hadn't had anything to eat. Upon thinking that, she glanced at her teacher who was sprawled on a leather cushion on the sofa. The gray rat had raised its front paw and pressed on its right eye. "Do you need any food?" Hazel asked reverently. The rat lowered its front paw and answered unhurriedly, "There's no need." "All right, teacher." Hazel turned around and walked forward, opening the door to her bedroom. Her lady's maid was standing along the corridor, leisurely looking at the balcony at the end of the corridor as though she was admiring the afternoon sky. Hazel indiscernibly frowned and said, "Guard this place. Don't let anyone in." The lady's maid shot one glance at her and smiled. "Yes, Mississippi." Only then did Hazel leave her bedroom and head for the activity room on the second story. She found her mother, Ma'am Rihanna. This lady with the same black-green hair received a pair of gem-embedded glasses with a gold chain hanging from it from her lady's maid. It was more an accessory than an eyesight correction tool. "Don't tell me that you don't like it?" Hazel asked in puzzlement. The corners of Ma'am Rihanna's mouth curled slightly. "I like it now." As she said that, she wore the glasses. As Hazel was just about to say something, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned her head to find her father, Member of Parliament mocked, coming home early. "Father, didn't you say that you'd be at the military veterans mess?" Hazel asked in passing. "There wasn't anyone there today." Mocked raised his right hand and pinched the two sides of his eyes. Hazel thought nothing of it as she nodded. "Perfect, we haven't had high tea together in a long time." "That's right." Member of Parliament mocked and Ma'am Rihanna laughed at the same time as a faint smile appeared on their lips. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard, who had just returned from St. Ireland Square, threw himself onto the sofa as he lifted his feet onto the coffee table. Having not received any information, he believed that the punishment operation had come to a perfect end, allowing him to look forward to the spoils of war. "Old man, didn't you say that the Sanguine Viscount had many mystical items on him? Can you tell me what they are?" Leonard softly asked in puzzlement. In his mind, Palaz Zorost harumphed. "Items of that level aren't worth my notice." Leonard was just about to press further when his vision suddenly blurred. He saw the boundless grayish-white fog and Gairman Sparrow's blurry figure, as well as his prayer. "Amon has appeared at 39 Buckland Street, but there's only one. Amon has appeared?" "That quickly?" Leonard, who had already relaxed, retracted his feet immediately and sat straight up. He became more anxious than before the punishment operation began. He hurriedly informed Palaz Zorost of Klein's words and asked, "Old man, what do we do now? Begin the operation?" "But there's only one Amon avatar." Palaz Zorost fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "If there's only one Amon, it implies that he has other motives, but none of that matters. In the 4th epoch, there's a saying, there's no point crying over spilled milk. Since it has begun, we can't falter. If we delay this any further, Amon will attempt to influence the entire street. When that happens, he will definitely discover Dwayne Dantes' abnormality." Klein returned to the real world and walked out of the bathroom. He had already made the corresponding preparations. He had creeping hunger on his left hand and an emblem carved from obsidian in his right. Then, he made a nunny snap his fingers and use flaming jump to enter 39 Buckland Street, Member of Parliament Mock's house, with the appearance of Gairman Sparrow. Control of the spirit body threads was instantly transferred to Klein, but this only seemed to sink into the vast ocean without any reaction. He had lost control of his marionette. This. Klein's eyelid twitched as he heard the door to the master bedroom creak open. It was a nunny. This youth with Lone and Balam blood in him had pushed open the door and walked in, completely outside of Klein's control. He then took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and rubbed it with his sleeve. Then, he leisurely wore it on his right eye. He then looked at Dwayne Dantes, the corners of his mouth curling up. Found you. The mood in the bedroom froze as a nunny, who was pinching on the monocle, continued. Flora Jacobs' destiny was filled with too many abnormalities, and they mainly came from the street. This piqued my interest, and I spent some time to distinguish and seek out the source. It took me so many days to find you. I'm no stranger to this mirror, and I can control it, but I've never seen it ingratiate itself so much towards one person. This really is an interesting matter. Perhaps I should steal your destiny and see why that is the case? Ah, right. You likely do not know of its origins. It's in no way simple. Chapter 1005 Fourth movement. Wearing a monocle, Amon, who wore the appearance of a nunny, didn't seem like an infiltrator or assailant. Instead, he appeared like a visitor as he eagerly mentioned all the preparations he had done, as well as Rhodes's origins. He paused before he could finish his sentence. Dwayne Dantes opposite him had turned into a dirty gray rat. The rat raised its right claw, pressing at its eye. At the same time, in the garden of 160 Buckland Street, with his thin and cut, black-haired, brown-eyed face, Gairman Sparrow appeared in the middle of a bunch of roses. Back when Amon was saying something highly enticing, he had secretly split off a worm of time in an attempt to invade Klein's body in order to parasitize him. However, Klein had been on high alert the entire time. He detected this attempt via the changes in his spirit body threads, so he rapidly created a marionette at the critical moment and swapped locations. Silently, Amon, who looked like a mixed-blood youth, appeared in front of Klein. Behind him, a 12-ring transparent worm fell from the third story and returned to his body. And at that instant, the earthworms in the garden soil, the insects in the woods, the rats in the shadows all crawled out, either swarming towards Gairman Sparrow and Amon or were fleeing from this region. The main reason why Klein had patiently listened to Amon was to use that time to create marionettes. To a bizarro sorcerer, they were only complete with their marionettes. Amon still wasn't in a rush to take action. He pinched the monocle embedded deep in his eye socket and looked around, saying with a smile, "Your actions often expose your problems. To a master of deceit, everything that you did was enough for me to detect your weakness. In such a tense and dangerous situation, you actually chose to convert rats, insects, birds, and earthworms into being your marionettes without considering your servants. What does this tell me? It says that you have outstanding moral standards. You still view yourself as human and are unwilling to harm them. Upon grasping this point, even if my avatar is inferior to you, it's still easy to break you down. You wouldn't even be capable of dying even if you wish for it. Ah, right. You can stop your attempts at secretly controlling my spirit body threads. This is because you're controlling the spirit body threads I stole. They belong to your butler, your maid, and your coachman. If this continues, I'm afraid you will feel a deep sense of guilt. Even spirit body threads can be stolen? No, it's more like grafting." Klein's expression froze slightly as he terminated his control of Amon's spirit body threads. He had been patient, allowing Amon to drone on with his drivel, mainly doing so because he was secretly trying to turn Amon's avatar into his marionette. To a bizarro sorcerer, battles like this, where he stalled for time and exerted his influence in secret, should have been something he was best at and something he enjoyed the most. Unfortunately, he had encountered blasphemer Amon, the current pinnacle existence of the Marauder pathway. Even if he was only facing an avatar, he could do nothing about him. Klein actually suspected that Amon's words were a ruse, but he wasn't able to see through it. He didn't dare take the risk. During such times, he needed the help of a spectator. For you to say so much, I doubt it's solely to think of the means to parasitize me, right? You should know that, before severely injuring me, it's very difficult to parasitize a bizarro sorcerer who can see spirit body threads, Klein calmly said as he wore Gehrman Sparrow's face. Amon immediately chortled. You've finally noticed it. You're trying to steal my destiny? Klein swapped locations with a marionette once again, constantly making his actual body appear in different corners of the garden. No. Amon shook his head, keeping his hands in his pockets while leisurely saying with a smile, if a magic mirror like a Rhodes is willing to listen to your instructions and deliberately ingratiate itself towards you, it means that you aren't as simple as I imagined. I'm not a beyonder of the tyrant pathway, so I wouldn't be so rash as to directly steal your destiny. Heh, I suddenly have a feeling that directly replacing you would result in something I don't wish to see happening. How did you know a Rhodes is ingratiating itself? Flora Jacobs' destiny shouldn't have something like that. Klein appeared on a tree. His different marionettes continued changing their locations. Amon pulled out one hand and pinched his chin and said, Didn't I say why? I spent time to gather information and seek out the source. Oh, I went to the Church of Steam and had a chat with a Rhodes. It wasn't too frank, and it was willing to be tortured by me rather than reveal your true origins. Unfortunately, that was inside the Church of Steam, otherwise, I would have directly parasitized it and learn of everything. Even living sealed artifacts can be parasitized. If a Rhodes strictly abided by the rules, based on its answers in the past, he isn't too sure of my actual situation and only has certain guesses. Klein's eyes widened. Just as he was about to say something, he heard Amon laugh and say, You really don't seem to be in a rush. What are you waiting for? Do you not know that my Pathways Sequence 2's name is Trojan Horse of Destiny? Although I'm only an ordinary avatar, I do have some powers that I can use, such as tinkering with your destiny, making certain errors appear for a certain period of time. For instance, no one will notice it no matter how much you cry for help. That also means that, even if you were to trigger the Evernight emblem in your hand, you will only be able to get the effects of concealment, and you will not be able to transmit your intentions of seeking help, regardless of your prior agreements. Also, even if you were to shout for help or create an explosion, the pedestrians and servants in the room wouldn't be able to hear a thing. This is the reason why I was talking so much. For an ordinary avatar, certain matters take time. Alright, it's your turn to answer my question. Klein didn't answer as he kept switching positions with his marionettes. However, Amon kept appearing in front of him as they continued their conversation. At this moment, he made one of his marionettes ask, Since you've already completed the controlling of destiny, why aren't you taking action? You also seem to be waiting. Before this Gehrman Sparrow, who was a thin, paper figurine, could finish his sentence, there was a strong gust of wind from afar. Leonard, in a black trench coat and a black silver-inlaid cane in hand, flew to Buckland Street. Klein, who had appeared to Amon's side, immediately said, This is what I've been waiting for. As he said that, he triggered the Evernight emblem that he had been clasping tightly. Simultaneously, he snapped his left hand's fingers, igniting the tallest tree in the garden, making its scarlet flames soar into the sky. And this huge, obvious bonfire, that would have been noticeable at a glance from across the street, was noticed by no one, be it the maids wiping the windows on the first story or the pedestrians strolling beneath the Intis parasol trees. Even in midair, Leonard Mitchell ignored this scene, rushing for 39 Buckland Street at high speeds. And at this moment, Palez Zorost's slightly aged voice sounded in this red gloves' mind, Turn back. Head to Unit 160. Although Leonard was puzzled, his experienced self didn't ask why when it came to supernatural matters. He immediately swung the direction word of the sea pointed and changed directions. In the garden of 160 Buckland Street, Amon raised his head as he pressed the crystal monocle on his right hand, chuckling. This is also what I've been waiting for. He ignored Gehrman's sparrow as his smile grew obvious. He continued speaking in irresistible delight, to be able to discover the abnormalities of fate in this region. It's him, Palez. As he spoke, this blasphemer changed his actions and adjusted his monocle. At this moment, a strange gloom fell over the entire street. It was as though the entire place had been separated from reality, turning into a secret. In the activity room of 39 Buckland Street, Hazel looked out the window and muttered in puzzlement, "Is it about to rain?" This wasn't anything important, so she retracted her gaze and reached out her hand onto the 3-layered tray for high tea. Then, she saw her father, Member of Parliament mocked, strangely open his right palm. Glimmers of light condensed out of thin air, forming into a crystal monocle in his palm. Mocked then wore this monocle on his right eye. This. Hazel had already sensed something amiss as she frantically looked at the others in the room. Her mother, Ma'am Rihanna, took off the accessory on her nose and wore a monocle that she had taken out of somewhere. The servants standing beside her all took out a similar monocle and wore it on their right eye. Thud. Hazel stood up instinctively as she retreated repeatedly, toppling the chair over in the process. This sound alarmed everyone in the room. Mocked, Rihanna, and the servants turned their heads to look at Hazel. Bit by bit, a smile suffused the comers of their lips. Ah! Hazel broke down as she let out a shrill scream. This scream passed through the house and through the garden, drawing the attention of the pedestrians on the streets. At this point, Amon had already lowered his right hand from his monocle. Looking at the figure in midair, Eat said with a smile, "Palez, it's already 1350 of the 5th epoch. The technique of relying on the gathering of avatars to raise one's level is already outdated." Behind him, Klein didn't waste any time as he reached into his pocket as though he was drawing a gun while he made creeping hunger turn transparent. A transparent book condensed in front of him. However, Amon simply raised his hand and the glove vanished. However, along with the human-skinned glove's disappearance, Gehrman's sparrow also did. Pa! Landing in Amon's palm wasn't a glove but a rat that had died after becoming a marionette. On the other side of Amon, Klein, who wasn't wearing a hat but was wearing a shirt and vest, appeared. He then threw out the item he had previously taken out, and he threw it at his target. It was a paper crane. Chapter 1006 finale and ending. It was an ordinary paper crane, bursting into scarlet-red flames just as it flew out, scattering ashes in the process. Amon, who had been looking up into the sky, suddenly turned his head and looked at the paper crane, who was a vessel of flames. He then raised his palm again. A cold glint had lit up in the eye beneath the monocle. Suddenly, the flames on the paper crane's surface vanished. Klein and his ability to swap locations with his marionette vanished. Likewise for flame controlling, flaming jump, and air cannon. In that instant, he had 6 Beyonder powers stolen, 4 of which were rather important ones. If Amon was able to make a few more thefts, then Klein might have even turned into an ordinary person. This was theft at the angel level. Amidst the extinguishing flames, the paper crane slowly floated. Backlund, Dr. Aaron's house, in a black pram. Wrapped in silver silk, Will Septon rubbed his mouth and eyes, grumbling, "Life is just so hard." Before he finished his sentence, he took out what looked like a cane from somewhere. It was embedded with clear gems. Pure bright light lit up, illuminating the calendar in the room clearly. Today was Tuesday, 160 Buckland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes's garden. The paper crane, which was already charred and incomplete, suddenly froze in midair. Complicated chrome-colored symbols appeared out of it, instantly taking on the form of a huge, illusory, scaleless snake. The dense patterns and symbols on the surface of the gigantic silver snake formed a wheel that was connected to each other. Around each wheel were different symbols. With a sweep of the cold, bright red eyes, this giant serpent soared into the sky and stayed above Buckland Street. It curled its body and bit its own tail. Its shadow blanketed the entire street like a mysterious and ludicrous wheel. Suddenly, mocked, Rihanna, and several servants in 39 Buklun Street's activity room wiped the smiles from their faces. They raised their hands in unison, taking off the monocle on their faces, allowing the monocles to turn incorporeal in their hands before transforming into beams of light. Immediately following that, they wore their eye accessories once again and pinched their eye sockets, either leisurely looking out the window or returning to their former state. Hazel sat on the ground watching this scene. As she shook her head, feeling the world crumbling around her, she used her hands to hold her body up while rapidly retreating. The cold glimmer in Winner Anuni's eyes vanished. The crystalline monocle was left cooked, and he no longer wore that supercilious look. In addition, something in his body seemed to be extracted as a clear, thick, but transparent and mysterious worm of time took form above his head. And amidst concealment, this worm of time quickly transformed into a figure with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face. This wasn't time reversing itself on Buklun Street, because Klein and Leonard didn't suffer any of its effects. It was Amon having his condition returned to a few minutes prior to this. Snake of Fate. Reboot. Although Wuxia had predicted that there would be some changes in fate, things had happened slightly later. However, his influence that descended from afar came in such a timely fashion. In order to gain this Snake of Fate's help, Klein had not only fed him 5 different flavors of ice cream, but he had also agreed to further compensation. The outcome of their negotiation was that Klein had to think of the means to create at least 2 items that could allow Wuxia to briefly regain some of his strength while in his weakened state. When Amon suffered this unexpected blow, Klein didn't hesitate and drew Death Knell. He cocked it, gently pushed the cylinder, and aimed it at his enemy. Bang! He staidly and decisively pulled Death Knell's trigger, shooting out the control spirit bullet he had long prepared. A black stream of light flashed out, striking the illusory Amon figure with the sharp bonnet and classic black robe, the Worm of Time. This was even thicker and clearer than all the Worms of Time Klein had previously seen before. The light scattered as Amon's figure quivered in midair and froze without being able to wear any expression. And at this moment, Leonard, who had already arrived overhead, followed Old Man's instructions. Standing on Word of the Sea, he floated in midair, slightly spread out his arms, and relaxed his spirit body. Both his green eyes immediately reflected a slightly gloomy, 12-ringed transparent worm of time in each one of them. These 2 worms of time had their heads and tails connected together, forming a similar loop. As the loop slowly spun, they projected a huge ancient modeled illusion behind Leonard. This illusion looked like the surface of a wall clock carved from stone. There were 12 segments, each segment was either grayish-white or bluish-black. They were clearly demarcated from each other, and the symbols were all different. With just one look, Klein had the feeling that life was speeding past him. Gong. A bell gong that seemed to travel across time from ancient history resounded through the spacious secret world. Everything before Klein seemed to slow down, including the Amon figure above Anuni. An indescribable invisible surge appeared, sweeping around that Amon figure before hurling it towards that huge, illusory stone-carved wall clock. What was actually a worm of time, Amon's avatar with a monocle, suddenly extended a hand, aiming it at Gehrman Sparrow. Suddenly, Klein saw the skin on the back of his hand rapidly dry up as they wrinkled up, producing unobvious aged spots. The speed at which Amon's illusory figure was being pulled away slowed down, but the process couldn't be interrupted. Finally, it contracted into the form of a ringed worm and was thrown towards the illusory, ancient stone-carved wall clock behind Leonard. Gong. Another bell gong sounded as the grayish-white and bluish-black clock surface had an additional modeled hand. This hand quickly rotated a few segments, speeding up the sound of the gongs. Inside 39 and 160 Buklun Street, all kinds of resplendent glimmers of light flew out, pulled and attracted by that ancient, illusory, stone-carved wall clock. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. He had used the connection between the avatars and his higher level to strengthen the law of Beyonder Characteristic Convergence. Gong. Several streams of light from different spots in Backland flew over. After everything calmed down, Klein's current appearance appeared in his mind. He had more white hair than black. His forehead and the corners of his mouth and eyes were covered with obvious wrinkles. His skin had sagged with several aged spots. He looked like an elderly gentleman, ready to pass away at any moment. At this moment, the clock's gonging sounded again. The grayish-white hand on the ancient, illusory stone-carved wall clock began spinning counterclockwise. 1 tick. 2 ticks. 3 ticks. Klein saw his skin rapidly recover its luster as the spots faded and vanished. In just seconds, he recovered his original appearance. Life had seemed to begin flowing in him again. Powers at the angel level are almost godlike. I only suffered some repercussions of it, and I nearly died of old age. I wonder if I can revive under such conditions. Klein observed his condition and hurriedly looked up and said to Leonard Mitchell, "How should the people parasitized by Amon be rescued?" At this moment, the ancient, illusory clock behind Leonard rapidly faded away, turning into glimmers of light that drilled back into his body. Leonard cocked his head slightly as though he was listening to something. After a while, he said, "The beyonder characteristics of the worms of time in them have been sucked out. The remaining parts have either been absorbed or have some remnants left behind. However, it wouldn't result in having an excessive influence on them." Old man said that it won't be excessive, but it might be from the viewpoint of an angel. In short, they can pray to the deities they believe in and see if they can obtain a complete purification. However, without them explaining what exactly happened, the deities might not give a response. If you're afraid of any remnant effects, you can consider guiding them to pray to, that existence. All the items that come from that will be yours. Perhaps having personally experienced a battle at the angel level, and having seen the snake of fate's spectral form, Leonard's agitation and trembling could hardly be suppressed in an instant. The people on this street are basically the believers of the goddess, so how can I get them to pray to the fool? I don't wish to be thrown into the foggy town. The goddess is very aware of this matter. They will likely receive a response if they were to pray to her. Then, I can get Her Eminence Ariana to return the worms of time that they cough out to me. I can give her some. As Klein's thoughts raced, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He then asked in passing, "Will there be any side effects after a complete purification?" Although he had some experience from Little Sun, this youth of the City of Silver wasn't an ordinary person. After listening for a moment, Leonard said, "A little. As it's a deeper level of parasitizing, even if ordinary people were to experience a full recovery, there will be some level of influence left on them, such as them liking to wear monocles." "All right. Head back first. Leave the rest to me." Klein nodded and was glad that the parties involved in this battle weren't the kinds with obvious destructive might. Otherwise, it might not only be Buckland Street, but all of Northborough might not be left intact. In Pritz Harbor, a black-haired, black-eyed, thin-faced young man wearing a monocle rode on a bicycle as he leisurely returned home. He wore an obvious smile as he opened the letterbox and took out the newspapers and letters inside. After entering the house, the young man pinched the monocle on his right eye while tearing open the letters, reading their contents as he walked. This continued until he found a letter without any name on it. If all connection to us in Backland is lost, it means that Palaz Zoroast might very well be hidden in the vicinity of Northborough's Buckland Street. Don't ask us why we're taking such risks. Life often requires some excitement, joy, and anticipation. 1. Author's note: to make the plot run smoothly, the details of a tarot gathering was skipped. As for Will's prediction, a deviation happened because of Amon's ability to bore through fate. Chapter 1007 Dealing with the aftermath on 160 Buckland Street. After watching Leonard fly out of the world of concealment with the word of the sea in one hand, Klein turned his attention back onto his surroundings. He first observed Winner Anuni. He originally imagined that he couldn't use the marionette that had been parasitized by Amon, but to his surprise, he realized that he could control his spirit body threads again. This Klein was first stunned before he came to a realization. When Snake of Fate Will Septon used Reboot to reverse Amon's condition in time, it also made the things he parasitized experience similar changes. Hence, Enuni had turned back into his marionette. As expected of the strongest power of a monster pathways sequence 1. Klein heaved a sigh of relief before allowing his figure to fade away from where he stood. He teleported back to his master bedroom, leaving a bunch of marionettes around to defend against any accidents. Right on the heels of that, Klein entered the bathroom and headed above the gray fog. He used Enuni's prayer light and began observing the entire street with the sea god scepter in hand. Without a doubt, his focus was on his residence in Unit 39. He found Butler Walter, Housekeeper Tanaja, Member of Parliament Mocked, Ma'am Rihanna, and many servants having remnant signs of being parasitized. They appeared somewhat in a daze. As for Hazel, she was on the brink of total collapse. Her hands were on the ground, having pushed herself backwards into the corner. Her back was leaning close to the wall as she huddled into a ball, trembling. Mocked and company had noticed something wrong with her. They surrounded her in concern, hoping to know why. However, Hazel would scream loudly whenever they attempted to approach her. She would resist violently, so all they could do was stand meters away, wearing a panicked and helpless look. During this process, they would, from time to time, nudge their glasses or pinch their eye sockets. This only served to leave Hazel even more horrified. She appeared to be on the brink of losing control. Klein felt horrified when he saw this scene above the gray fog. He imagined the scene: Daddy Amon, Mommy Amon, Maid Amon, Footman Amon were circling around Hazel, trying to soothe her nerves but were helpless. They wore the same expression and the same monocle with different clothes. Even if Hazel were to hold out and not lose control, she would definitely develop mental problems. At the very least, she would be in a half-crazy state. Klein's thoughts raced as he lowered the sea god scepter and returned to the real world. Buklun Street and the several streets remained enshrouded in darkness. It exuded a serene, tranquil, and profound feeling. This was a world that had already turned into a secret. Klein took down a hat, wore it on his head, and teleported to a director's office in 22 Phelps Street, Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Audrey had already changed into a light green dress and was daydreaming with a fountain pen in hand, reminiscing over every detail of the punishment operation in the afternoon. Susie, on the other hand, had gone out for a stroll. Suddenly, this noble lady sensed something and looked up. A black-haired, brown-eyed, thin-faced figure with cut facial features was rapidly reflected in her emerald, limpid eyes. This figure wore a white shirt, black vest, black trousers, and black leather boots. He had a cold expression, his body was bent slightly as he held one hand over his top hat. Audrey was first taken aback before she recalled who this person was. Gehrman Sparrow. Although she had never met him before, she had already seen his extremely lifelike picture on the papers and wanted posters. Klein realized that he hadn't changed back to Dwayne Dantes based on Miss Justice's reaction. However, he wasn't too mindful of that. He released his hand from his top hat and straightened his body. He said with a nod, "There's something that requires your help." His disguise had also been stolen by Amon. But after a reboot, it was returned to him. He just didn't have the time to change back into Dwayne Dantes. Mr. World, who's already a demigod, needs my help. He's in need of therapy because of some mental problem? No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Audrey pursed her lips as she put down her fountain pen in anticipation and curiosity. She stood up and gave a serious reply, "No problem." Klein didn't waste any time and walked over. Grabbing her by the arm, their figures faded away as they vanished from the spot. Instantaneously, they appeared outside the activity room at 39 Buklun Street. This is teleportation? Audrey's eyes turned slightly as she instinctively wanted to ask something. However, when she felt the heavy atmosphere and the screams, her face immediately wore a solemn look. "There's a patient?" she asked without much doubt. It's really easy to talk to a spectator. There's no need for much explanation. Klein tersely acknowledged and said, yes, she encountered a supernatural incident and suffered a terrible fright. She's on the brink of losing control. Do you have the means to not be seen by the people inside? There was no need for him to say his last sentence, as a large-scale illusion was enough to resolve the problem. Furthermore, after receiving the blessings of concealment, ordinary people likely didn't retain much of their corresponding memories. However, after witnessing Adam's powers of invisibility, Klein was rather curious if Miss Justice had such skills at Sequence 6. Mr. World is feeling curious. That's really rare. He doesn't seem to be wearing a thick mask and has changed to a thinner one. He's a really good patient who heeds medical advice. Audrey's chin moved slightly as she nodded. Yes. As she spoke, she glanced at Gairman Sparrow, who reached out for the handle and pushed open the door after receiving her response. Member of Parliament mocked and Ma'am Rihanna completely ignored this beautiful girl as they discussed in a panic about hiring a doctor. As for Hazel, she remained curled in a corner, trembling vigorously like an abandoned baby animal. Miss Hazel, as a senior spectator, Audrey didn't have the problem of forgetting others. She observed Hazel's condition and frowned slightly. She turned her head and said to Gairman Sparrow, Mr. Sparrow, can you briefly explain what she encountered? Only with sufficient knowledge can I quickly resolve the problem. Klein was already prepared as he quickly and succinctly explained, she's a beyonder of the Marauder pathway, a student of a demigod who had nefarious thoughts. Her teacher attracted blasphemer Amon's avatar and ended up getting herself killed. Her destiny and identity were stolen. As such, Amon infiltrated her family, parasitizing her parents and servants. Just now, while we were eliminating Amon's avatars, she realized that her parents and servants had all turned into Amon. She didn't know that was Amon, but she understood that it was a strange existence. If you have anything you wish to understand at a deeper level, things which do not involve the psychological treatment, you can always ask during the next gathering. Blasphemer Amon? Mr. World and company have eliminated Amon's avatar again. No avatars? Audrey was somewhat shocked as she instinctively glanced at Mocked and company. She couldn't imagine that they had once been parasitized by Amon and had turned into him. To have everyone parasitized. Audrey recalled Mr. World's words and felt more afraid the more she thought about it. She felt her entire body turn cold as she couldn't help but think of herself if she were in Hazel's shoes. This left her somewhat stifled as she subconsciously cast placate on herself. Is the supernatural world always this cruel and terrifying, or is it just occasionally? After calming down, Audrey muttered softly. She didn't wait for the World Gairman Sparrow's reply, because from what she had seen at the tarot gathering, she knew the answer very well, always. Looking back at Hazel, Audrey walked over, filled with pity. She crouched down and first used placate. Hazel looked up blankly and saw a perfect, flawless face, as well as that pair of emerald-like eyes. At that instant, she seemed to return to the ball of that previous night, having witnessed this lady descend like an angel. She instantly calmed down. She saw ripples rise up in that pair of limpid, green eyes. They were serene, calm, and deep. There's no need to be afraid. Calm down. Everything is already over. Audrey used hypnosis to directly communicate with Hazel's body of heart and mind. She heard hysterical screams and the horror that was taller than mountains and deeper than the ocean. Taking into account Hazel's condition and encounter, she quickly came up with a plan for treatment. She directly hypnotized Hazel and made her forget today's encounter and the existence of her teacher. She was only capable of vaguely remembering her identity as a beyonder and other general knowledge. Hazel gradually calmed down before she slowly fell asleep. After you awaken, that terrifying experience will no longer exist, and I was never here. Audrey used a gentle voice to complete the last step of the hypnosis. Following that, she slowly got up and observed Hazel for a few seconds. She pursed her lips and whispered without turning her head, I made her temporarily forget the corresponding memories, but that memory remains. It's just hidden deep down. In future gatherings, I'll continue treating her, guiding her to slowly remember and accept this memory. Only then can her mental problem be completely resolved. Otherwise, perhaps a familiar action or sentence will jolt her awake. She will then break down once again, and perhaps it will result in a direct loss of control. Miss Justice is becoming more and more professional. Klein sighed as he asked cautiously, then you will have to hypnotize all the people who were parasitized. They are not to show any hobbies that don't originally belong to them, like the wearing of monocles. Also, let them pray to the Evemite goddess after 15 minutes to obtain complete cleansing and purification. Audrey nodded with abnormal seriousness. No problem. Klein immediately stood to the side, watching this noble lady, everyone who had been parasitized in this house with the greatest feelings of pity. Chapter 1008. Splitting minutes later, Klein, with the face of Gehrman Sparrow, walked out of 39 Buckland Street with Miss Justice Audrey and headed for places where the other parasite victims were. After a few silent steps, Klein suddenly looked ahead and said, "It's not rare to see such matters happen among unaffiliated Beyonders. Without any suitable guidance, it often implies that they're constantly dancing at the edge of a cliff with the possibility of falling at any time." Audrey tersely acknowledged and said after a few seconds, "I know. Compared to before, I'm not as, she deliberated for a moment before breaking into a grimacing smile, as though she had found a suitable adjective she required to mock herself. Naive. Phew. She then exhaled without hiding it as she looked ahead. If I had known that the mysterious world was so cruel and terrifying last June, I might not have raised the request of becoming a Beyonder." Klein turned his head slightly and took a look at the noble lady's face. He asked in a seemingly casual manner, "If I were to give you the chance now to completely leave the mysterious world, would you accept it?" Audrey was taken aback as she slowly pursed her lips and said, "No." After giving such a response, she seemed to relax a little as she smiled and continued, "Under the premise of knowing how cruel and terrifying the mysterious world is, the me from last June would have given up being a Beyonder. But the me of this year wouldn't. This might be the price of growing up." "I understand what you're getting at." Klein continued forward at the same pace as he said, "After those victims are completely purified, a number of them will spit out worms of time. They can be used to create fate siphon charms. It's a demigod-level item that can switch the fate between two parties for a short period of time. When the time comes, I'll give you one as payment for today's treatment." Audrey was about to decline it before she fell silent again. She then nodded gently and said, "Okay, /Wu 11AW or LD. SITE." Just as she said that, she suddenly paused. She turned her head to glance at Gehrman Sparrow and smilingly said with a mixed expression, "I know why you just asked me that question." Klein chuckled without giving a direct answer. Audrey retracted her gaze and immediately felt a lot better. She asked as though they were having a chat, "I participated in the punishment operation at noon, and I dealt with the Amon aftermath in the afternoon. Today is really a tarot day." Her words were a double entendre as she said with utmost wistfulness. From her point of view, noon was a cooperative operation that involved 5 members, the moon, the star, judgment, justice, and the magician, with different levels of involvement. In the afternoon, the tarot clubs The World and Justice had involved themselves in the elimination of Amon's avatars in different ways. This was indeed a day to remember, and in a sense, it could be considered a tarot day. Klein nodded in agreement at Miss Justice's words, but he didn't tell her that the star Leonard had also been involved in the afternoon operation. Furthermore, he was the main force in the operation. Amon's avatar must have been difficult to deal with, right? Audrey finally found an opportunity to raise the question. She stared at Gehrman Sparrow, making no attempt to hide the curiosity in her green eyes. Klein smiled. "If I had done it alone, you wouldn't be seeing Gehrman Sparrow, but Amon here instead. Having your destiny and identity stolen?" Audrey asked in enlightenment. Klein tersely acknowledged. "We'll discuss the specifics in the future. In short, to eliminate all of the Amon avatars in Backlund this time, we had mobilized angels. If you were to encounter Amon's avatars in the future, never believe that you have the means to handle him alone. immediately find an opportunity to seek help. Yes, his trait is the wearing of a monocle. He enjoys pulling off harrowing pranks. Angels were mobilized. I wonder if it was that death console or the angel from the fate domain, or... Audrey looked up at the sky and saw the clouds frozen in midair. They appeared like props under the dark background. Like an attentive student listening to a teacher, she seriously nodded and said, "I will keep that in mind." The two continued walking, occasionally silent, occasionally breaking out into a conversation until they entered 160 Buckland Street. After a few minutes, inside the activity room of Hazel's house, Mocked and company suddenly had the strong urge to sit in their seats, raise their hands, and place their clasped hands before their mouth. They then began to piously pray and chant the Evernight goddess's honorific name. After an unknown period of time, they coughed in unison until their tears and snot flowed out. Cough. 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 Without realizing it, they separately coughed out worms with 12 translucent rings. The moment these worms fell to the ground, they vanished without garnering any notice. Similar things happened in other places of Buckland Street, but everything was quickly restored to normal. And the darkness had faded away at some point in time as the clouds began churning again from the sweeping winds. Amidst her parents' coughing, Hazel slowly regained consciousness. She was puzzled as to how she fell asleep on the sofa during high tea. She felt that she should have been in an excellent mood, but she just couldn't bring herself to smile. She felt as though there was a feeling of indescribable sadness and pain bearing over her heart. Upon seeing her parents' concerned gaze landing on her, not only wasn't she touched, she even felt a little fearful. She trembled like an introvert who wasn't accustomed to making contact with others. Hazel knew that this wasn't her personality, but she couldn't control herself. However, she didn't find it weird or puzzling as she continued enjoying the high tea pastries. Mocked and Rihanna felt the same. They had a nagging feeling that there was something hazy about their memories, but they just couldn't recall what. 160 Buckland Street. In the master bedroom, which had its curtains drawn, a figure suddenly outlined itself across the coffee table. It was the barefooted Ariana, leader of the ascetics, matron of the Evernight cloister, head of the 13 archbishops of the Church of Evernight. She was wearing a Spartan robe with tree bark as her belt. In the lady's eyes, the gray sideburn Dwayne Dantes was about to leave the sofa. On the coffee table in front of him were 9 transparent ringed worms. "Good afternoon, Ma'am Ariana," Klein said with a solemn bow. "Thanks to your help, Amon's avatars in Backlund have all been eliminated. You can choose a portion of these spoils of war." He had previously prepared a marionette beside every person who had been parasitized, and he used an illusion to bring these worms of time back. After hearing him, Ariana tapped her chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion and replied in a pious manner, "Praise the lady." She didn't decline the offer or stand on ceremony. She reached out her right hand, and 2 worms of time flew up and landed in her palm. Amon must have certain guesses about this. "You still have to be careful in the future," Ariana said simply before her figure vanished inch by inch as though she had been erased. Watching this archbishop leave, Klein sat down and picked up a pen and paper, writing to Leonard Mitchell. He wanted to ask what other effects the worms of time had other than creating fate siphon charms. He believed that he couldn't turn all the remaining worms of time into fate siphon charms, as it would be too monotonous. It made it easy to be countered, and it prevented him from handling different situations. Therefore, he had to consider other possible uses. With the worm of time as a vessel, he could use the powers stirred from other symbols, patterns, and labels that differed from the Fool. This would likely result in different effects from the fate siphon charm. And this was something Palaz Zoroast was an expert at. After writing his letter, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew at it. Rionette walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed head in hand. The 8 eyes paused before looking at the remaining 7 worms of time on the coffee table. Miss Messenger looked at it for 3 full seconds before retracting her gaze. She then bid on the letter and gold coin which Klein handed over. "Still 7 Pinster Street," Klein succinctly said. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied, "In the future, you can seek my help in such matters. The payment will be the spoils of war." Klein was taken aback as he said, "All right." After Miss Messenger returned to the spirit world and vanished from his room, he frowned and muttered, "Since she can recognize the worms of time, it means that she knows that this battle might have escalated to the level of angels." She wasn't afraid at all. Miss Messenger is stronger than I imagined. 7 Pinster Street. Leonard received Klein's letter from Rionette Tinker's mouth. He still felt a hint of excitement as he eagerly unfolded the letter and read it. After the messenger left, he immediately asked with a suppressed voice, "Old man, there should be other ways to create charms, right?" Just now, Palaz Zoroast had given him 2 worms of time from Amon as today's reward for the risk he took. In Leonard's mind, the slightly aged voice replied with a smiling tone, "Of course, once I sleep for a while and digest what we received this time, I'll teach you. It wouldn't take too long. Also, do not go to Baklun Street anytime soon." "Why?" Leonard asked in surprise. Palaz Zoroast chuckled and said, "All of Amon's avatars in Baklund have been eliminated, and it is in no way a trivial matter. The number of people who can do that is just a handful. So, do you think he will have some guesses?" This. Leonard's nerves tensed up again. Palaz continued, "However, there's no need to be too worried. His true body wouldn't be able to enter Baklund, and having recovered quite significantly, I don't have to be too worried about his avatars. In addition, I've found a piece of information from Flora Jacob from his memory fragments. Somewhere in Baklund hides the treasure of the Jacob family. We shall wait until the end of the year for the gathering. There, we will seek out and cooperate with the other descendants of the Jacob family to excavate that treasure trove to share the items inside. When that happens, even if Amon gathers a large number of avatars, raising it to almost the level of a sequence 1, there's no way he can truly defeat me. Heh, to ensure balance, Dwayne Dantes can also be involved in it." Chapter 1009 Payment is always exacted for what's bestowed. Leonard immediately felt very relieved when he heard Old Man Palaz. He cast his attention back to the angel-level battle that happened in the afternoon and asked rather curiously, "Which Pathways angel does that giant serpent phantom belong to?" Palaz Zoroast fell silent for a moment before saying with a sigh, "Snake of Fate. The counselor of the Life School of Thought. A Sequence 1 angel. I never expected him to join them, counselor of the Life School of Thought. He has also become a blessed of Mr. Fool. The corresponding card is the Wheel of Fortune." Leonard's eyes widened as he realized that Mr. Fool's faction seemed comparable to the 7 Orthodox churches. It was truly unfathomable. Death Consul. Snake of Fate. Incomplete Messenger. There are 3 angels under Mr. Fool. It's no wonder Klein was able to become a demigod so quickly. Just how long has it been and I've already been embroiled in a battle at the angel level. It's really unimaginable how things will develop in the future. Leonard held the letter and sat on the sofa. He felt another sense of urgency towards digesting his Soul Assurer potion and advancing to Spirit Warlock. He had been busy placating the souls in the Baklund region recently, but due to the numerous missions, he was still far from completing them. He couldn't find an excuse or opportunity to visit Tingen City to steal the powers from that drop of the eternal blazing sun's blood. Furthermore, the arrival of Amon's avatars had been quicker than he had expected. South of the bridge, Rose Street, Harvest Church. Emlyn White, who had changed into a brown priest robe, stood in front of a long table with candle stands. He watched Ernst Boyar working hard at wiping the altar before he raised his right hand and casually pointed. To the side. Left side. That spot's dirty. Ernst Boyar, who also wore the clergyman attire of the Earth Mother, shot an angry look at Emlyn, but he still listened to his instructions and re-wiped the area he hadn't wiped seriously. "I know you're very mad. It's how I felt when I learned that you deliberately hid key information from the ancient castle intel you sold me," Emlyn said with a smile, completely unfazed by his glare. "Also, I forgot to inform you. I'm also a Viscount. It happened last week. Sanguine Viscounts corresponded to the Moon Pathways Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar. The advancement ritual required the illumination of the full moon. Apart from that, one had to gather different metals, gems, and beyonder creature blood that represented the different moon phases. It was rather complicated. However, Emlyn had long obtained the promise from the sanguine upper echelons that a free advancement ritual would be held for him. He could advance easily once the full moon came. As for the digestion of potions professor, he had completed digesting it without putting too much effort into it. This was because he often taught commoners who were willing to learn at the Harvest Church to learn about herbs and medicine, and even combinations of some special potions. And apart from usually collecting dolls, researching history, and doing volunteer work at the cathedral, he loved thinking about the different potions and considering how they could be used in different battle situations. You're a Viscount? Ernst Boyar abruptly stood up straight as he wore a flabbergasted look. Among the sanguine, as they were all long-lived, they had quite a huge population. The number of beyonder characteristics was limited, so advancing was a very difficult endeavor. One had to be in a long line before they had the opportunity to advance. However, Emlyn White had only been a baron for half a year. Ernst remembered that it took him 6 years to go from baron to viscount. This was because his father had suffered an attack from artificial vampires. His passing left him the inheritance. Of course. Emlyn's smug smile grew obvious, but he remained restrained. I obtained a sequence 5 beyonder characteristics from artificial vampires. Ernst Boyar looked at Emlyn, momentarily at a loss for words. He felt that he had suffered a heavier blow than needing to do volunteer work at the Harvest Church. Your expression is rather interesting. Emlyn sked and said, perhaps one day, you'll have to address me as Lord when I become an Earl. Preposterous. What arrogance. Ernst blurted. I'm already very humble. I didn't mention I would become a duke or even a princeps. How am I to be the Sanguine's messiah without being an angel? Besides, in our tarot club, Mr. World has already advanced to become a demigod. Ma'am Hermit won't take much longer. This will definitely be a club filled with demigods. Emlyn chortled without arguing with Ernst like he usually would. He took on an attitude that whatever Ernst said was beneath him. Of course, he also understood that the advantage the Sanguine had after the Scarlet Scholar stage no longer existed. Becoming an Earl was in no way easier than an artificial vampire advancing to Shaman King. The digestion of the Scarlet Scholar potion is still relatively simple. All one needs to do is sincerely like the moon, worship the moon, and study the moon. This is what most Sanguine do usually, however, the corresponding ritual is in the hands of the demigods. Without their approval, even if I were to obtain a Shaman King beyonder characteristic from the sun, I won't be able to become an Earl. Emlyn might be arrogant, but he knew very clearly what was required of him subsequently. There were 2 core powers of Scarlet Scholar. First, it was to create an environment that was advantageous to them. When the enemy wasn't good at spirituality or things related to the spirit world, they could create the effects of the full moon. On the contrary, they would also make the moon vanish if necessary. Second, it was to gain an instantaneous blink and a spectral form state under a certain area of the moon's illumination. Even if they were smashed to bits by an enemy, they could still reform themselves under the moonlight. And the strength of these powers was derived from one's comprehension and research of the moon domain as Scarlet Scholars. As for the strengthening of darkness-related spells, the enhancements of potion effects, and the resistance towards nightmare-like influences, they were just supplementary. Ernst was enraged by Emlyn's attitude. Just as he was about to speak again, he saw the mountain-like half-giant, Yutravsky, walk out from behind the cathedral. He hurriedly bent his back and bowed his head as he continued cleaning the altar. Emlyn White also picked up his cloth and the candle stand, wiping its surface with great proficiency. In the silent atmosphere, he thought of something. If he were to leave the Harvest Church now, would the upper echelons of the Sanguine force him to hand over the mystical items and supernatural props he obtained from I really have no reason to reject their request, because some of the items don't belong to urns in the first place. Emlyn thought about it seriously and decided to return to the room later. He would set up a ritual and sacrifice the spoils of war he received to Mr. Fool. When the time came, he could split it with the other members like the Star and Justice. Oath of Rose cannot be sacrificed. It's only one part of the pair. Whoever obtains it will be discovered and identified by the wielder of the other ring. I'll just treat it as a spoil of war. I'll hand it over to Marquis Nibs tonight. I should be able to exchange it for some rewards. As for the rest, I won't participate in the splitting. Emlyn very quickly came up with a plan. As for whether the sanguine upper echelons would bear a grudge over this, he wasn't too worried. This was because he would also mention in passing about the cooperation that the Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction had requested while handing over the Oath of Rose. This matter had happened last week. He had planned on informing the sanguine upper echelon, but in the few mini-gatherings, the hanged man had advised him to do so after the punishment operation. It would accentuate his importance and mitigate any anger or resentment. Striking with a stick and offering a carrot? At that moment in time, Emlyn suddenly had a deeper understanding of the suggestion. 160 Buckland Street. Inside Dwayne Dantes' bedroom. The spoils of war received are pretty good. A diamond brooch that can raise one's energy and maintain lucidity while resisting spells that act on the body of heart and mind. A paper figurine that can prevent any fatal damage and psychic piercing. A belt that can produce sun and lightning damage. A wallet that contains more than 300 pounds. After receiving the sacrifice and returning to the real world, Klein silently sighed as he sat in front of his study desk. He then took out a transparent maggot. Upon seeing this maggot, he felt his head ache, recalling the pain of having his soul-body fracture. This was a worm of spirit that he had fractured from himself. It was to be made into the payment given to Snake of Fate Will Septon. He already had an idea on how to replicate the item which could briefly allow someone to restore their strength. It was to use the worm of spirit as a vessel and copy the complete symbol from before to garner a response from the mysterious space above the gray fog. For this, the outcome of his divination was that it would be rather successful. That item's true essence is actually one of the powers of the Seer Pathways Sequence 3, Scholar of Yore. To borrow a portion of one's power from one's past self. Responding with the Fool's identity would definitely work. The only problem is that the corresponding dimensionality, mystery, complexity, and danger of the symbols cannot be directly engraved on different metal plates. According to Will Septon, I have to use cogitation and draw on my spirituality to draw it on the worm of spirit. If it succeeds, I'll make myself one. I'll look at myself from the past and see if it will be Klein Moretti's childhood or myself hanging in the cocoon above the door of light. If it's the latter, it's best if I can confirm how long I've been hanging. Klein entered a cogitation state while in thought. Then, he kept constructing symbols with his mind, allowing his spirituality to repeat this process outside as it penetrated the worm of spirit. This was a complicated and difficult task. If he wasn't careful, it might lead to failure. As the invisible symbols fell and augmented the worm of spirit, Klein suddenly trembled. The worm of spirit ignited by itself and turned to ashes. Looking at his empty palm, Klein felt a headache. After a long period of silence, he silently muttered, "Life sure is difficult." Chapter 10:10 Consultant Fee. After rubbing his forehead, Klein was just about to split another worm of spirit when he suddenly saw Rionette in her dark, complicated-looking dress walk out of the void and stand beside the desk. In the mouth of one of Miss Messenger's heads was a neatly folded letter. "Who's it from?" Klein asked in passing. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied, "The Mushroom King's Superior, Mushroom King?" Klein was stunned for a full 2 seconds before realizing that it could be Frank Lee. And Frank Lee's superior was Admiral of Stars, Catlia. "The Mushroom King is Frank Lee?" Klein asked in confirmation as he reached out to take the letter. With the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads' hair being held, they were made to bob up and down as though they were nodding. Miss Messenger even gives others nicknames. That's not right. Frank doesn't just specialize in mushrooms. His domains include cows, malt, fish, rose bishops. It's because Frank has had a breakthrough in his mushroom experiments, so Miss Messenger saw a boat full of mushrooms? Klein couldn't help but draw a breath as he hurriedly unfolded the letter. He was worried that the letter was Ma'am Hermit's plea for help. Of course, he wasn't too anxious because, at the most critical juncture, an experienced pirate like Admiral of Stars would definitely choose to pray to Mr. Fool. This letter did come from the future's captain, Catlia. On it were neatly written words. The Queen has already confirmed the time and place. Wednesday, 11 p.m., same place. I've no idea what you said to Frank Lee, but I can tell that he has been very excited recently. He has done many experiments with the artisan. He said that he would be able to produce another phase of results in 3 to 6 months' time. He also made it clear that if he were to obtain the Druid potion, he could save on making many intermediary objects and directly produce the final outcome. All I can say is that I wish you the best. I hope that everything will come to an end before the artisan completely breaks down. He has already begun regretting his faith in the primordial moon. Should I be happy that the securing of the City of Silver's food supply has progressed, or should I be worried about accidents? Klein rubbed his temples and decided to put the matter aside. After all, Ma'am Hermit, who was almost about to become a demigod, was watching Frank. If some unexpected development really happened, she would definitely seek help. Phew. Having finally confirmed his meeting with Queen Mystic, he heaved a sigh of relief and flicked his wrist, burning the letter in scarlet-red flames. After watching Miss Messenger leave, he continued splitting a worm of spirit when he suddenly frowned. He felt that the desk and the letter's ashes in the trash can were abnormally off-putting. Subconsciously, Klein got some tissue and wiped the desk before covering the trash can. After doing all of this, he looked at his dirted hands and stood up. He headed for the washroom and turned on the tap. As he washed his hands, he caught sight of the toilet beside him through the corner of his eye. He frowned bit by bit again. Today's cleaning wasn't done well enough, Klein softly muttered and suddenly sensed something wrong with him. Amidst his thoughts, his spiritual intuition quickly explained why he was feeling this way. This was a side effect of using Death Knell. As he had already become a demigod, allowing him to have a qualitative change in his spirit body and attain godhood, the corresponding negative effects had been reduced by more than 90%. The terrifying weakness of germophobia ended up becoming a trait of cleanliness OCD. Likewise, the period of weakness dropped from 6 hours to 1 hour. And the thirst that Death Knell gave him was no longer as obvious. Thankfully, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he skillfully pulled out the toilet brush from the side. 11 in the evening, above the gray fog, due to Emlyn White's request, all the members who had involved themselves in the punishment operation, Justice, the Star, Judgment, the Magician, and the Hanged Man, appeared inside the ancient magnificent palace. These are all the spoils of war. Emlyn threw 3,000 pounds that he had just sacrificed in the middle of the table and explained, one of the mystical items was Oath of Rose. It's a paired ring, allowing the wearers to be able to share their senses and thoughts with one another within a normal-sized city regardless of the distance. It's very valuable, but only one of the rings was acquired. It would spell danger for anyone who takes it. Therefore, I handed it over to the sanguine upper echelons and received 3,000 pounds in return. He originally thought of keeping the 3,000 pounds as his spoils of war, but he decided that it was better to sacrifice it and make it be one of the options. After a pause, Emlyn introduced the other items, listing their uses and negative side effects. He had even added more to the description. Knowledge stemmed from his penchant for sanguine history and some shared by Ernst Boyar under Father Yutravsky's watch. He is doing it with the intent of flaunting. Otherwise, with Mr. Moon's character, he wouldn't say so much. Oh, the reason for him being relaxed is due to Mr. Fool's absence. Audrey watched as a bystander without saying which item she wanted. Alger glanced at the spoils of war and said to Emlyn, "Have you met the sanguine upper echelons? Has the hunting of the key members of the Rose School of Thought been confirmed?" "Pretty much. I've also established contact with a member from the Temperance faction. However, He wishes to carry out the operation after September. Emlyn didn't hide the truth, believing that Mr. Hanged Man could provide useful pointers. Indeed, Alger nodded and asked, "It has to be after September?" This means that they are waiting for something that will drastically change the situation. Klein, who was waiting for the mini-gathering to end somewhere else in the ancient palace, suspected that it had something to do with Miss Sharon's advancement when he heard that. According to Miss Sharon, she should have been able to attempt the demigod ritual in July. Don't tell me that this ritual will last at least a month? If that's the case, it's quite different from the other pathways. Klein had a theory he wasn't too sure about. Possibly. Emlyn thought for a while before agreeing with Mr. Hanged Man's words. Following that, he surveyed the area and said with a smile, "You can begin choosing." Audrey had Mr. World's promised fate siphon charm, and Leonard had obtained the corresponding rewards from Old Man Palez. They appeared rather calm with the spoils of war offered by the Sanguine Viscount. None of them rushed to speak as they politely waited for the others to go first. In addition, they had either experienced an angel-level battle in person or witnessed the horror brought about by Amon's avatars. Furthermore, they had confirmed that the Tarot Club contained potent forces, and they were suffering from some level of mental fatigue. Zio looked to her right before looking forward. Seeing everyone being so modest, she broke the silence. "I was involved in a very simple part of this and didn't take much of a risk. Furthermore, Mr. Moon has already paid £60 in advance. I'll just take the cash in the wallet." As she spoke, she took the handcrafted wallet, took out the cash, and counted it. £335. Emlyn surveyed the area and nodded when no one objected. "Okay." As for the handcrafted wallet, Zio threw it in the middle of the table and returned it to Mr. Moon to handle it himself. With Zio taking the lead, Furs said, "I only lent out Lamino's travels and didn't take on any risks. I'll take that moon paper figurine." Compared to the mystical items, such expendable Beyonder items were relatively lower in value. However, to the magician herself, she wouldn't have selected a mystical item even if she was qualified. This was because she could hire the corresponding member to record it if she needed a particular power of the mystical item. As for moon paper figurine, an expendable item that could take a fatal blow and psychic piercing once, it couldn't be recorded. It was definitely the first choice for someone who feared for her life. After saying that, she waited for a moment. Only when no one objected did she take the moon paper figurine. Emlyn then cast his gaze at Miss Justice. Leonard extended his hand and said with a smile, "Ladies first." Audrey didn't decline the offer as she swept her gaze across the items on the table. She pointed at the diamond brooch and said with a smile, "I'll take this." She had heard Mr. Moon mention that its name was Alcohol Nemesis. It kept the wearer brimming with energy with lucidity in their thoughts, giving them resistance to influences on the body of heart and mind. Thankfully, I had first used bribe charm to be safe, and with Ern still being in a half-conscious state after waking up from the dream, I wouldn't have been able to hypnotize him. This item is also useful to me. At the very least, it will give me another layer of protection when facing the higher-level members of the Psychology Alchemists. I don't have to worry about the negative effects if I don't always wear it. Audrey thought thankfully as she retracted her gaze from the diamond brooch in satisfaction. After the selection, Emlyn didn't give Leonard the chance to speak as he directly said, "This moon sash is yours." From his point of view, the moon sash was worth more than £5,000, something more valuable than the £3,000 in cash. Actually, I was leaning towards taking the £3,000. I have to buy the Word of the Sea, and the price is still £10,000 after Klein gave a discount. After spending that, I'll only have £650 in savings. Leonard ultimately didn't reject it as he nodded. Okay. Emlyn finished distributing the spoils of war and picked up the remaining £3,000 in cash. He then split a stack and pushed it to the side. "Mr. Hanged Man, this is your payment. £1,000. You should call it the consultation fee." Without Mr. Fool present, Furs was also a lot more relaxed. Alger didn't stand on ceremony as he nodded, reaching out to take the stack of cash. The compensation for the carriage driver will also be borne by me. Emlyn surveyed the area in a rather good mood. 11 p.m. on Wednesday, at the south entrance of the Backlund Bridge. A figure quickly phased into existence in the night sky, with one hand on his hat and the other hand by his buttons. He had black hair, brown eyes, and sharp facial features. This strongest adventurer with the cold expression was none other than Gehrman Sparrow. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.